Hey guys, welcome to a new video. Like, comment and subscribe if you enjoy. Without any further interruptions, enjoy the What If. Chapter 9. The Divide. Jugram Hashwalt was not one to show his emotions lightly, which was a well-known fact among the Sternritter. Therefore, the reason behind Royd's surprise when he heard Jugram's chuckles. He had sensed the exploding reiatsu of the head captain, but he knew that Jugram's response was caused by the other significant event that occurred at the same time. It seems that Sternritter A has completed his task splendidly, albeit a little late compared to my expectation. He should have arrived here already, according to our plans. Perhaps you could provide some of your insight on the matter, Grand Master. Royd asked. The SRDI was already out of the picture for quite some time, if that is what you wish to know, Your Majesty. Sternritter Z had her own plans in this invasion, I believe. Regardless, Ichigo is more than responsible enough to remember his duties. I have no doubt that he will show up in due time. Jugram replied. Royd hummed for a second, and turned his gaze back to the supposed strongest captain of the Gote 13, completely at his mercy in his grasp. When the man dumped the lifeless body of his brother in front of him, he vowed to kill the man no matter the consequences. The strongest captain, not including Yamamoto perhaps. The old man could kill him in the blink of an eye if this is all he has. I see. Special war power Zaraki Kenpachi, how the mighty have fallen. It would appear that I may have overestimated you people, if the rest of the individuals we evaluated to be a special war power is as pathetic as you. Rest in peace, as Soul Society is about to come to its end. Royd said, and was about to end the man's existence when he was interrupted by the firm, steely voice of the man he had been expecting. It has been 1,000 years, Yhwach. I am here to end your life, once and for all. Yamamoto roared, with his flame-like reiatsu storming the whole area. The reiatsu itself was heating up the area, but neither the Grand Master or the foe Emperor showed any sign of being affected by it. Royd threw the near-dead form of Kenpachi to Jugram, and ordered. As much as I would like to end the beast's life myself, I shall leave the task to you, Grand Master. Yes, Your Majesty. Now then, where were we? Ah, yes. If you are here to kill me, you are free to do so, Yamamoto Shigekuni. Although I cannot help but to ask, what makes you think that you can end my life when you have already failed once, 1,000 years ago? We are here today because of your failure, after all, said Royd in a nonchalant manner, only to mutter a second later. Those pitiful fools. Two figures attempted to ambush the head captain, only to be engulfed by the flames of Yamamoto's blade. Royd swallowed the sigh of relief as he sensed that Bazb had managed to protect themselves from the flame with his shrift. But he couldn't show such behavior when he was under the guise of the Emperor. If everything were to work as planned, he could not show any sign of difference in his behavior, or rather the Emperor's. The enemies must not know of the change in His Majesty's objectives, or rather, Aizen must stay unaware of it to the end if he were to be precise. They should have known better than to intrude on my battle, Royd muttered. Yamamoto shifted his eyes from the flames that had engulfed three of the enemies, back to the foe Emperor, and narrowed his eyes more so than usual. What is it? You look like you have something to say. Your Majesty. Royd quickly raised his arm to block the head captain's strike as soon as he heard Jugram's warning, utilizing his blood veine at its fullest. While the flames of Ryujin Jaka left a nasty burn on his forearm, Royd knew that it wasn't a significant wound. You haven't changed a bit, Yhwach. You never did value the lives of your subordinates, but your cruel ways are about to come to an end. Yamamoto spoke, not expecting the man to scoff in response. Those words would hold much more credibility if it didn't come from you, Yamamoto. Who are you to judge, when you yourself never cared for your own subordinates? Royd retorted. You have grown old, Yamamoto Shigekuni. But when I see you submit yourself to your anger, it's almost as if I'm looking at your old self again. Silence. Yamamoto roared, and swung his Zanpakuto with all his might, determined to obliterate the existence of the monstrosity who calls himself the King of Quincy. Royd's hand quickly found its way to the metal-like Quincy cross attached to his trench coat, and formed an ornate reishi sword which had a bird-shaped cross guard. It clashed with the most powerful fire-type Zanpakuto in existence, deflecting the blow to the side. Finally, you draw your blade. You speak like you were waiting for me to do so. And why, do you think that might be? Replied Yamamoto. Let me tell you, Yhwach. It is so that I may shatter your blade, your soul, and your flesh into oblivion. Royd grimaced as the flames surrounding the ancient Shinigami and the blade of Ryujin Joka vanished. He knew that his chances of surviving through this was slim, and only hoped that His Majesty would recognize his services for the Empire. Bankai, Zanka no Tachi. Hira Izuru fell to the ground face first, dropping his now broken Zanpakuto in defeat. He could barely stand with all the blood he had lost, much less continue to fight his opponent. He had always thought that his Zanpakuto Wabisuke's ability was an extremely efficient one in melee combat, and he still stood by the same belief. But it was useless against this Quincy, who could easily discard the weapon that had been affected by Wabisuke and form a new one out of reishi. He had attempted to strike the Quincy himself, but once the enemy realized the ability of his Shikai was not limited to weapons, he hadn't allowed a single hit on his body. Even then, Izuru knew that he had no way to kill his opponent due to his defensive ability, although he had no way to know that Kang hadn't shown even half of it. You fought well, Shinigami, much better than what I expected from a lieutenant, and you have my respect for that. As I said earlier, those who live together should stay together even in death, so you will be joining your subordinates shortly. I shall give you a painless death, as it is the least I can do for a worthy foe like you. Kang said with a nod, only to receive an answer from another person. I'm afraid not, Quincy. Captain, Izuru muttered out, only to groan in pain immediately. I see that I was not overly late, Izuru. I was held up on my way from the captain's meeting. Now try to patch yourself up while I deal with another one of these Quincy. I'll take you to the 4th Division when I'm done with him. Kang quirked his eyebrows at this proclamation and spoke up. Captain of the 3rd Division, Otoribashi Rojiro, yes. I find it rather disconcerting that you speak as if you have already won, when you do not even know of my capability, as your lieutenant was unable to force me into using my shrift. I must ask, though, which one of my fellow Sternritter have you come across? Some guy with teeth that were colored like piano keys, who apparently had no understanding of art. And before you ask, I killed him. Rose replied, and released his Shikai, Kinshara, without speaking its release phrase. That would be Nana. How so? With my Bankai, of course. He seemed confused that he couldn't steal my Bankai, I believe. I thought that he was joking at first, but apparently some of our captains have lost their Bankai. I wasn't sure of what made me different from the other captains, but I could sense that Shinji didn't lose his Bankai either. After that, it was fairly easy to guess that you lot don't get along well with the hollow part of my Zanpakuto, which is basically a part of my soul. It wouldn't be long before our SRDI comes up with a countermeasure to your method of stealing our Bankai. Kang adopted his usual indifferent expression, not that worried about Rose's comment. If they knew that their own Bankai was the last thing they should worry about, they wouldn't be holding on to such foolish hope. What he did know was that Nana probably didn't get the chance to use his Vollständig, most likely due to the enemy's Bankai. If Nana had the chance to use it, he doubted that the captain in front of him would be standing alive. Well, he did warn us that there was a high possibility of our medallion not functioning properly against at least 3 of the captains. But you got one thing wrong, Captain. Your SRDI won't be able to come up with a countermeasure, because they won't live long enough to do so, said Kang in a serious voice. And while I did not particularly care about the fool, I'm afraid I can't let it slide. Rose frowned for a second, and tensed his body to prepare for the upcoming combat. I wasn't going to let you walk away alive either, regardless of how you killed my seated officers, which I doubt that you would be of any difference. Indeed. Kang nodded in agreement, and vanished from the spot. As soon as he noticed Kang's usage of Flugbildskrit, Rose jumped back a fair amount of distance, and barely avoided his throat being ripped open by Kang's reishi claws. However, he did receive a small scratch from it. Now, that really wasn't polite, Rose said while wiping the blood off his neck with his hand. Of course, this is war. Surely you didn't expect me to announce all of my attacks firsthand. Kang retorted, firing a barrage of Hylig files from his claws. Rose quickly lashed out with Kinshara to intercept the arrows, his eyes not wandering away from the enemy at the same time, for not even a second. Just as he expected, Kang struck once more by closing the distance with his Floodbuild script, but Rose was prepared to launch a counterattack. Rose sidestepped, and caught Kang's wrist with his free hand, and pulled his Zanpakuto. Kang's eyes widened for a moment as Rose retracted Kinshara to impale him with the deadly tip of the whip-like Zanpakuto, but turned his attention to its wielder and lashed out with his knee. Rose grunted as he felt some of his ribs crack upon contact with Kang's knee, but he knew that the enemy would take much more damage than himself in this position. He let out a gasp of surprise when he was proven wrong, the tip of Kinshara failing to penetrate the Sternritter's defense. It feels as though he blocked it with an iron shield. It seems that my blood veine is insufficient to protect myself from a foe on your caliber, which is hardly surprising. But thankfully I do not need the blood to protect myself, so I can focus on my blood artery instead. Kang lashed out with his hand that hadn't been caught to sever the captain's head, prompting Rose to release his grip on him and put some more distance between them. However, Kang easily caught on that infighting was his opponent's weakness due to the whip-like form of his Zanpakuto, combined with his near-impenetrable defense. Granted, Rose was a captain even 100 years ago for a reason, proven by his graceful steps and skillful parries with the whip part of his sword. One could even consider his skills to be a piece of art, without an ounce of exaggeration. As they kept exchanging blow after blow, which neither of them took any serious damage, Rose had to admit that he had no hope of winning if this continued. He felt the need of change in this meaningless exchange, and attempted to constrict the Quincy with Kinshara. Kang was nearly caught off guard with the sudden change of tactics, due to the fact that Rose's Zanpakuto couldn't harm him physically. However, he did know that whatever the captain had planned wouldn't be a pleasant experience. Kang prided himself in his defensive ability and skills, but he was neither arrogant nor stupid enough to take every move of his enemy head-on. He knew that just because he could coat his skin with iron using his shrift did not make him invincible, hence the reason he was wary of his opponent's Bankai and unknown techniques. Apparently Rose wasn't expecting Kang to be caught with his move. What he really intended was to make him back off, just enough for him to change the tides of this fight. Rose raised his hand above his hand, and swung his sword downwards. Kang easily dodged the strike, only to be caught off guard at the words that came out of the captain. Kinshara Sonata No. 9 5 Flowers Despair. Rose scratched his fingers against the whip part of his Zanpakuto, resulting in a shrieking sound to explode from the tip of Kinshara. While he did not like to use this technique due to it being hardly artistic, he would never doubt its effectiveness, which was proven mere seconds later. Kang winced, and covered his ears to shield himself from the sound, only for it to be revealed as an ineffective act. Rose did not give him any time to recover, and swung Kinshara once more. While the tip was still unable to impale the Quincy, it wasn't Rose's intention to do so this time. Rose tapped Kinshara with his fingers, and a vibrant glow spread through it, accompanied with the strumming sound of a guitar string. Kinshara Sonata No. 11 Rose of the 16th Night. Kang gritted his teeth as the shock wave caused by the reverberating sound of Kinshara shook up his insides, and virtually destroyed the whole area near him. Kang ended up coughing up some blood from the internal damage he received, but he knew that it wasn't a fatal injury with his blood veine. He certainly did not expect the captain to deal this much damage to him without bringing out his Bankai, which turned out to be a mistake on his part. He wiped the blood off his lips with the sleeve of his coat, and placed his fists together with their wrists facing each other. Shi Jin Jiao. Kang fired a pair of reishi blasts from his fists, which took a serpentine form and rushed towards Rose at an alarming speed. Rose quickly lashed out with Kinshara, and tapped it once more. Kinshara Sonata No. 11 Rose of the 16th Night. Another shock wave spread from the tip of Kinshara, which collided with the serpentine reishi blast, and successfully negated Kang's technique. Kang frowned, knowing that the enemy wasn't giving his all even without his Bankai. Granted, he still had his Vollständig left in his arsenal, and he still had the upper hand in this current state. But for how long? I'll give you some credit, Shinigami. Even without bringing out your hollow side or using your Bankai, you have proven to be an admirable opponent. I'm sorry to say that playtime is about to end, and I won't waste my time trying to draw out your Bankai either, since Nana provided the proof of it being a waste of my time. Oh, you have something left up your sleeve, Quincy? Rose asked, which made Kang to nod as his speculation was confirmed to be true. Nana didn't show you, I see. Your Bankai must be quite dangerous if that was the case, said Kang, and brought his hand up to his lightened hand. Allow me to introduce you to the completion of our power, the Quincy, Vollständig. Rose frowned as a pillar of light engulfed the Quincy, and made the decision to use his own Bankai, only to be interrupted by Kang's words as his changed form was revealed. I'm not really the type to give a name to my Vollständig, so I can't give you a name unlike you lot. The name of your Zanpakuto or Bankai is quite important, yes. I personally found the idea to be ridiculous until recently, when I learned that your Zanpakutos were basically a part of your own soul from Ichigo. What? Gah! Rose yelled in utter disbelief, only to let out a pained scream afterwards, caused by an iron spike which impaled his lower abdomen from behind. I'm also not above using such dirty tricks to my advantage. I would do almost anything for His Majesty, even give my life for him if it meant something worthwhile to the Empire. Kang muttered with a wave of his hand, causing another spike to shoot up and skewer the center of his chest. Ichigo was born as a Quincy, did you know? He should have been raised as a Quincy, but all he got was the deception from your kind, including even. As the sound of a massive explosion rang across the entirety of the Seraiti, the ground beneath them shook violently in following. It wasn't all that hard for Kang to deduce the person who had caused it, due to the unmistakable hollow reiatsu that spread like a wildfire throughout the atmosphere. Seriously, he would have to be a complete moron if he couldn't figure it out. That was Ichigo succeeding in his task, raising the SRDI to the ground. The very department where his mother's soul was violated in the worst way possible in the afterlife, to be dissected and experimented on. But then again, you yourself would know some of it as being one of Aizen's hollowification experiments. Rose growled at the mention of his, no, their past, even as to ignore the pain he was feeling at the moment. You dare. What would you know? Of course I would know. It was your kind who took advantage of our declaration of war, and slaughtered innocents and children in a sneak attack. It was your kind who slaughtered the remaining Quincy in the world of the living, and performed all kinds of sick experiments on their soul. You were betrayed by one of your own, only to be exiled by the pitiful fools who claim themselves as nobles. Why have you returned to become a captain once more, Visored? Kang asked as he made the iron spikes disappear with a wave of his hands, and replaced them with thick iron chains that wrapped around the captain. Ichigo didn't want some of you dead, but he also said that he wouldn't hold any of your death on us. So I'll give you one chance to convince me with a valid reason to let you live. Izuru. No, Rose yelled out in warning, only for his face to be scrunched up in horror a moment later. Kang spun around, and lashed out with his claws which ripped through Izuru's already broken Zanpakuto, but it didn't stop there. Izuru's eyes widened as his body was split into half by the Sternritter, and Kang sighed as he could easily guess what would happen now. No matter though, since he would just deal with the captain as accordingly. Well, I did try, Ichigo. Can't blame me for the lack of trying, with what that lieutenant did. Kang muttered as Rose dropped his head in grief and fury. Kang shook his head in disdain as hollow reiatsu exploded from Rose, and a mask which resembled that of a plague doctor's formed on his face. The chains restraining him loosened just enough for Rose to become free once more, and grip his Zanpakuto. Bankai, Kinshara Butoden. Rose waved his conducting baton as the dancers of death emerged in front of him, a pair of large hands floating above him. He knew that he did not have much time with the injury he received, combined with maintaining the mask and Bankai at the same time. It was highly likely that he had only one chance to end up victorious in this battle, and Rose knew that he could pull this off. Sea Drift. The dancers of death surrounded Kang and spun around him, a strange melody ringing in his ears. What the? Kang muttered as he found himself being trapped within a whirlpool of surging water, unable to move. He could have sworn that he felt a drowning sensation, even. I think it is quite obvious now, that your ability is related to iron in some way. Iron's melting point is 1538 degrees Celsius, and I cannot help but to ask. Can you endure such heat? I can come up with a fitting dance for you, Rose said with a feral grin underneath his mask, raising his hand to conduct his song. Helios Hyperion. Every single dancer of death raised their hands, and a massive gathering of light formed over Kang. He gasped in pain as he felt as if his entire body was melting from the heat the artificial sun radiated, or was it a real one? Kang was one of the Sternritter with insane levels of pain tolerance, his only rival being Giselle, and maybe Gerard. For him to actually show such signs of pain, meant that he truly was in a life-threatening situation. Your Bankai must be an illusion-inducing type. This cannot be real, and I will not be fooled. Kang said in a raspy voice, only to hunch over in pain immediately. That's right, but you're also wrong at the same time. My Zanpakuto controls music, Quincy. Its deceptive melodies resound in your ears, and gives me the power over your very heart. If you are caught in the deceptions of my music, I can make you drown, burn your body, stop your breath, even as to make yourself end your own life. All of it may be a mere deception, but it becomes the harsh reality to my audience. Now, for the final dance before the curtain call. Ain't happening, Rose. What, Shinji? What the hell? Rose gaped at the bloodied form of his comrade, only to drop to his knees as the hollow mask he had on his face dissolved into nothingness. He could barely keep on the mask for 5 minutes, and holding himself together with his Bankai active was much more taxing than he expected. He realized that he couldn't have pulled off his final dance, regardless of Shinji's interruption. Shinji had blood all over his captain's Howry, burnt and ripped in many places. He himself had quite the injuries, varying from shallow cuts to his limp left arm. Rose could see, however, that the majority of the blood he had on his Howry was most certainly his enemy's. Kang seemed confused for a moment, but he reverted back to his normal form. While he was certain that he wouldn't have lost to the captain in front of him, he knew that it would be stupid for him to stay in his Vollständig state longer than necessary. It would only result in the waste of his stamina, and he knew that his situation was no better than before, now faced with 2 of the enemy captains, even if both of them were seriously worn out. I wanna hear about what exactly Ichigo is doing with your lot. Reasons, objectives, relations, everything ya can tell us, said Shinji, motioning Rose to calm down with his hand. And why would I spill such information? You are not in that much of an advantageous situation, if you were under the impression of such. Why, you, Rose started, only to be cut off by Shinji's stare immediately. It wasn't that often he had seen Shinji like this, but he was the Visored's de facto leader for a reason, and a very good one at that. Shinji's power itself was not something to be questioned, as all of them knew what he was capable of, including his Bankai. Sure, Hachier himself wasn't a joke in terms of power, but Shinji was a monster in his own right. Not that he showed it off, really. Shinji didn't disappoint in intelligence either, being one of the few who caught on Aizen's schemes earlier on. If Shinji was acting like this, he had a damn good reason on doing so. Rose sighed, and conceded with a nod. I've been having doubts about the whole Ichigo disappearing situation, added with the animosity between the other captains and Captain Kuretsuchi, as I've told ya before, Rose. If what he said had even a sliver of truth in it, I'm gonna drop this stupid war as long as no harm comes to us, as in the Visoreds. It was a stupid decision to return to our posts anyway, and ya know it too, Rose. I'm sorry for the death of Izuru, but he shouldn't have thrown himself into a situation he can't handle. This is war, Rose. And in war, there are always losses to both sides, Shinji said to Rose, almost pleading at him to take his word and drop the matter. Rose looked down, and closed his eyes. He was quite fond of Izuru, almost as much as one of his fellow Visoreds. He was an inspiring individual, and he would be undoubtedly spending some time mourning him. But yes, he probably could place it behind him if it was for the sake of the Visoreds. They were more than some friendly exiles who had to stick together, due to their rather unpleasant situation. They were practically a family, and family was above everything. Rose silently nodded to Shinji as an answer to his request. Phew, that's a relief. And as for why ya should tell us about those information. Shinji grinned, revealing all of his teeth as he usually did. I ain't gonna to risk ourselves in this war, if the Soul Society is in the wrong, and I'm quite sure that they are. The other captains received orders from the Central 46 to not even speak a word about what caused the rift between him and Kuretsuchi, which I'm guessing our Quincy here just told us a good enough gist of what that was about. But, Rose, how long do ya think it'll take before Hiyori and the others get involved with this shit? I faced these guys, and I know for a fact that I wouldn't be standing here alive if I didn't use my Bankai. Even then, I could have died just by being near him. Shinji muttered as he ran his hand down the back of his hair. Rose, family comes first. Our family. Our loyalty to the Gote is long since gone, and I know that your grief is about Izuru, not your division or the Gote. I get it. You said Ichigo didn't want us dead, and asked me for a valid reason to convince you to let me live. Right, Quincy. If you explain those to us, and if we are certain that our group won't be in harm's way from this war, we'll back off from this war. 3 captains. No, scratch that. 2 captains out of this war for good. I'm sure that counts as a valid reason. Rose questioned Kang, trying to keep his anger under control. Ah shit, Kensai will never abandon his division. We'll have to think about that later. Rose, will ya go and make sure that Kensai and Mashiro don't end up dead from this? I'll fill ya in afterwards. Shinji turned his attention to Kang. If ya agree to those terms, that is. Kang frowned for a moment, and nodded. He wasn't all that confident over his chances of victory against 2 captains who could use Bankai without him being able to steal it, not to mention their hollowification. That would be arrogance, not confidence. Very well. Kang wasn't all that fond of these Shinigami hollow hybrids, but he could keep himself neutral. They were whom Ichigo considered as friends, and Ichigo was the successor of His Majesty. His respect to His Majesty mostly extended to him as well, not to mention that Ichigo himself deserved to be respected as well. He could do this, if only for him. So he started to tell the leader of the Visoreds the information he wanted, quite honestly if not outright truthful. Shaolin bit her lower lips, as the side of her ankle connected with Yoruichi's palm. Yoruichi grabbed her ankle and hurled her to the ground, which Shaolin disappeared midair before contact. Her panting form appeared on the roof of a building, bruised in various places but not overly injured. Shaolin was somewhat ecstatic that her Hakuda had become at least on par with her idol, and a little disappointed that she still had a long way to go before she actually surpassed her. Considering the fact that she had no one to spar with outside of Ichigo and the Sternritter girls due to an obvious reason, being a Shinigami among Quincy, she was proud of her achievement. She had to give some credit to the orange-haired Quincy, though. Ichigo's Hakuda was nowhere close to her standards at first, but he caught on quickly over the months under her tutelage. She had been somewhat jealous at his progress, but Ichigo's hard-working demeanor made it hard for her to stay that way. Her progress basically depended on Ichigo's, and Ichigo had become somewhat of her equal in barely 3 months. She had no doubt that he would have progressed much faster than that, if he wasn't busy with his other training. If there was one thing she learned today, it was that Yoruichi herself hadn't neglected her own training. Her Shunpo was still a little faster than herself, and her own speed wasn't something to scoff at, which was really saying something. Yoruichi was out of shape the last time they had fought, but she seemed to be at her top condition now, due to her position as the captain of the 2nd Division. But there was one thing she knew that she was better at than her idol, and she intended to show it before their time was up. Shunko! Shaolin roared, as the Keto energy she emitted from her shoulders and her back encircled her form infinitely like a vortex. As much as I would like to say otherwise, you're still faster than me, Lady Yoruichi, albeit barely. But if there was something I surpassed you during the last year, it's my mastery over Shunko. To say that Yoruichi was shocked would be an understatement. She had known for quite some time that Sui Fon. No, Shaolin had the potential to become much more greater than herself. When she had partook in the rescue mission of Kuchiki Rukia in the Soul Society, she saw for herself the potential her pupil held. She expected Shaolin to master her Shunko, but not this early, no. She was thinking of a couple hundreds of years, or decades at the least. But to actually master Shunko already. I may have underestimated my little bee, thought Yoruichi. It wasn't an unpleasant surprise, though. If anything, she felt immense pride in her pupil for perfecting a technique, which she had failed to do so. At that time. My, Shaolin. You've certainly come a long way from the little bee I used to take care of. Shaolin couldn't hide her scowl at this remark, which didn't go unnoticed to Yoruichi. But I'm afraid you may be a little misinformed, my little bee. I can't afford to be outdone by my pupils, after all. Shunko. Shaolin gasped in realization at that point. Lady Yoruichi had mastered her Shunko. Of course, what was she expecting? Her master was the absolute best, and surpassing her wouldn't have been her life goal, if she were to accomplish it this easily. When Yoruichi's Shunko took the form of a pair of lightning wings sprouting out from her back, Shaolin grinned. She charged with a rush of wind, winding back her fist. As her arm lashed out to the mocha-skinned captain, Yoruichi slammed her own fist into it, already prepared since the moment Shaolin moved from her spot. A torrent of wind was released to both sides, and an explosion followed immediately, causing both of the women to fly backwards. Yoruichi was the first to recover. Yoruichi appeared directly above Shaolin, and sent a kick with the heel of her foot, only for it to pass through Shaolin's abdomen. Realizing that it was an afterimage, she spiked up her senses, and barely caught Shaolin's Reiatsu behind herself. She raised her arm, and redirected her punch to the side with a grunt. "You've gotten faster," Yoruichi said with a cat-like grin. "And I can go faster," Shaolin replied while smirking. "As expected from my little bee. Let's take this up a notch." Gusts of wind and flashes of lightning collided, and a small explosion followed each and every time they met. They were nearly equally matched, but Shaolin knew that their Shunko was not the same. Shaolin could maintain her Shunko as long as she deemed necessary, while Yoruichi could not. Yoruichi's Shunko was much more destructive, evident from the way Shaolin was pushed into the defensive. She knew that outcome of this fight would have been her victory if she had more time, but sadly there was a time limit for this. Shunko. Raijin Senki. Yoruichi's wings of lightning shifted into a circle of lightning that took the shape of Raijin's drums, making her intentions clear that she aimed to end this fight with this technique. Shaolin was more than happy to oblige, even though she knew that this wouldn't end up in her favor. Mukyu Shunko, roared Shaolin. Shaolin launched a blast in the form of a horizontal column of wind as she thrust her fist, meeting Yoruichi's vertical column of lightning. It seemed like the wind was about to pierce the lightning at first, but the lightning did not back down, and engulfed the wind, resulting in a massive explosion. Shaolin stared up at the sky as she laid on her back, and chuckled as she accepted her defeat. The circumstances were not in her favor, but she still accepted the result regardless of it. Only because she was her lady Yoruichi. Yes, hers. She looked up at the outstretched hands of her idol, beckoning her to grab it. And she did. What? Shaolin. Yoruichi stuttered as Shaolin grabbed her hand, and pulled her down instead of pulling herself up. Her cheeks flared as she gazed into the gray eyes of her apprentice, knowing fully well that Shaolin had harbored feelings for her, not so subtle if she might add. But had she really worked up the courage to act on it? Lady Yoruichi. Shaolin reached up with her hand, and cupped her cheek, and muttered. "I would have won if we had more time." "I know," Yoruichi answered softly. Shaolin took a deep breath, and blurted. "I love you. I've loved you for a long time." "I know, my little bee," Yoruichi said with a small smile, and leant down, capturing her lips with her own. It didn't last long, as both knew that their situation was hardly proper for such a moment. They broke the kiss, and stared at each other's eyes for a moment without speaking a word. Yoruichi was proud of her apprentice, of her progress in skills and a person. Shaolin was ecstatic that her feelings were requited, and how her master had acknowledged the improvement in her skills. Shaolin sighed happily, and tried to steal another kiss, going against the voice of reason in her head. She uncharacteristically pouted, when she was stopped by Yoruichi's finger on her lip, a sly grin forming on her own. Now, my little bee. While I know that I am an irresistible beauty," Shaolin almost scoffed, as she thought that beauty was a downplaying word for her. Yoruichi was a goddess in her eyes, and most people would agree on her sentiment. "We have to talk, Shaolin. What are you going to do now?" "No, what do you want me to do? If we let Yhwach win this war, it could end up in a worse situation, compared to letting Aizen make his way to the Soul King's palace. This isn't about the Gote, but the world, Shaolin. Lady Yoruichi, all you need to do, is to say this to that man." Shaolin scrunched her nose in distaste as she thought of Kazuki. "And you know who I'm talking about. Just tell him. Replacement, and he'll figure it out. I can't say much more than that." "I see." Yoruichi closed her eyes for a few seconds, and nodded. "By the way, my little bee, you shouldn't be calling your lover, Lady Yoruichi, wouldn't you agree?" Shaolin blushed madly at her teasing, the red coloring of her cheeks quite prominent. I guess so, Yoruichi. Yoruichi rolled her eyes, and pecked Shaolin's lip once more. She stood up while muttering. One step at a time, I suppose. Shaolin quickly followed suit, and turned to the direction where the blazing reiatsu of the head captain spread out all over the Seraiti. While she was a relatively young captain of the Gote, well ex-captain to be exact, she knew that such a phenomenon could be caused by only one thing. Is this the head captain's Bankai? Shaolin asked, and received a nod from Yoruichi. Well, as much as this reiatsu is overwhelming, he's going to die today. Ichigo is a monster in his own right, and even the head captain would have a hard time against him, not to mention Yhwach himself. Yoruichi's head snapped at her direction at this. Wait a second, are you serious? For one, he's faster than you, Yoruichi. His skills in his sword is about second best in the Wandenreich, and I doubt that any of the captains would be able to overpower him. His Schrift, which is a special ability bestowed to the Sternritter by Yhwach, is much more ridiculous than Aizen's Zanpakuto in my opinion. I don't really know about the other Sternritter, but Ichigo's Schrift is just. Shaolin shook her head, not really able to find the proper word to describe it. And just what is this ability? Yoruichi asked hesitantly. His Schrift is the amnesia. He has the ability to make you forget nearly everything he wants you to, but it's much more than that. The keyword is forget. He can make you forget how to breathe, or forget the name of your Zanpakuto. He can make your Zanpakuto to forget its own ability. If he were to be injured, he can make his body forget that he was ever injured. Not that he would need to do. He actually used this ability to negate my Naigeki Kesatsu. That's how they made you lose your loyalty to the Gote. But then, why did Ichigo take you as his captive? He said he spared me for the debt he owed to you, Yoruichi. That's the reason I'm still alive. And he provided me protection from the other Quincy in their empire, so I was treated more like a guest, rather than a captive. I want you to join us, Yoruichi. Please think about it. If I wasn't going to join them before, I will join them soon enough. If you worry about being cast to the side after all is done, Ichigo will guarantee that you won't. If not, please stay out of the war at the least. I hope that you would give me a positive answer the next time we meet. Shaolin spoke softly, and disappeared from the spot with Shunpo. Yoruichi rubbed her eyes, and sighed. It never gets boring when you're involved with Ichigo. She thought to herself. If she had doubts about Ichigo being somehow under the control of Yhwach or something like that, she had her answer now. Ichigo joined the cause of the Quincy's on his own accord, and seemed to have a good enough reason for it. What Shaolin suggested to her was to basically betray the Gote, but would it be horribly wrong for her to do so? She really held no love for the Soul Society after how they forced her to take back her captain's post, and Kazuki was never the type to be overly loyal. If Shaolin's words were true, Ichigo would be in a position with quite the influence if he could guarantee the safety of them. She could just choose to stay out of the conflict, which might be a little more preferable to her tastes. Till next time, my little bee. Quilge annoyingly stared down at the fallen form of Kazuki, only for it to pop like a balloon. Seriously, just how many of these portable gigais did this man have in his possession? It's not that it would be able to let the man actually harm him, but he couldn't tell the difference between the fake and the real deal by absorbing the reishi of it, due to his masterful skill in switching his body with the gigai at the last second. You're not taking this seriously. Quilge muttered, firing another blast of reishi. Nake, Benihime, Kazuki yelled, forming a crimson barrier in front of him, and added. Bakudo number 81, Danku. Kazuki didn't have that much experience with opponents who could rip apart his Chikasumi no Tate easily, and Quilge was one of those occasions. After almost taking a clean hit for the first time when Quilge's reishi blast destroyed his barrier to smithereens, he made sure to dodge if possible, and use a Bakudo along with his Zanpakuto as well, if he couldn't. My, what gave you such an impression, Quilge-san? After all, I'm not that eager to show you my Bankai when I haven't had the time to come up for a solution to your medallions. Kazuki spoke jovially. How would you know if I see? It must have been one of those filthy Arankar vanguards that gave it away, since none of the Sternritter are stupid enough to reveal one of our war plans before the war has commenced. But no matter, if you do not want to take this seriously, so be it. It is your funeral. Quilge said with a dramatic sigh, his finger set between his eyebrows. Well, I beg to differ. Licked region, Uryu muttered as he fired hundreds of arrows simultaneously. Quilge sighed once more, and held out his hand. To Yuryu's surprise, all of his arrows instantly dissolved when it neared him, and was absorbed to Quilge. Sclavere. It is the perfection of a Quincy's ability to gather reishi, allowing the user complete control over foreign reishi. Unless you yourself is in your own Vollständig, your reishi-based techniques cannot harm me, Ishida. Le Muert. As Chad winded his Brazo Izquierda del Diablo to strike from the behind, Quilge did not even look at his direction while swinging his sword. Chad was soon engulfed in a massive wave of reishi, mostly powered from absorbing Yuryu's own reishi arrows. Sado-kun. Orihime screamed, and quickly ran off towards the direction where Chad was falling down, smoking and charred. Now this is getting pitiful. Did you think that you could catch me off guard, when I'm in my Vollständig? Quilge scoffed. One can't even take his fight seriously, the wayward child knows that he can't do anything, and the last one is just too weak. Why are you even bothering to resist? I would not harm you overly so, and all you have to do is just stay put where you are. Nothing will change even if you make it to the Soul Society, seeing how you cannot deal with just one Sternritter. Quilge was about to fire another reishi blast towards the young Quincy, when he felt the concentration of Raryoku. Quilge's head quickly snapped towards Kazuki, who held his palm towards him with his other hand gripping his forearm, his Kido ready for fire. Hado number 88, Hiryu Gekizoku Shinton Raiho. A massive concentrated beam of electric Raryoku engulfed Quilge, resulting in an equally massive explosion. The dunes of Hueco Mundo parted in the path of one of the most destructive Kido, cast by one of the most sufficient practitioner of Kido. Orihime's eyes lit up with hope, while Nell clung to Pesci tightly, peeping behind his shoulder. Now, let's not jump to the conclusions. I never did say that I was fooling around, didn't I? Said Kazuki. He steadied his posture and grip on his Zanpakuto, knowing fully well that the enemy would have had enough time to shift between his two types of blood. If he was to be honest, they were in a tight spot. He wasn't completely sure that he would be able to defeat the Quincy, even if he could use his Bankai freely. If only Yoruichi was here with them, he could have found a way, but regrettably they were on their own. Well, he still had a few tricks up his sleeves though. Quilge's form was revealed with some burns covering parts of his body, his uniform a mess. If anything, he looked absolutely pissed. Kazuki didn't even bother to strike up another conversation, and took a step of shunpo. Kazuki appeared above Quilge with his Zanpakuto swinging down, which was easily intercepted with Quilge's reishi sword. He disappeared once more as Quilge fired a blast of reishi, and struck the Quincy from a different angle. Quilge blocked the second strike with as much ease as the first one, but Kazuki didn't stop there. He continually swung his Zanpakuto from various directions, each aiming at a different part of Quilge's body. He shifted places with his shunpo between a few strikes, catching Quilge off guard for a few times. Quilge had his own plans, though. He struck like lightning, and beheaded Kazuki. He wasn't all that surprised when it made a popping sound and deflated once more, the exact same way it had happened before. Another one of those blasted portable Gigais. Quilge thought in annoyance, and flew upwards using the wings of his Vollständig. He started to absorb the reishi of Hueco Mundo, from the sand to the boulders, and even Aeon, who was still incarcerated in its jail. He most certainly did not want to take such tainted reishi under his control, but he was determined to kill this annoying man-child for making a mockery out of him. It really was a good thing that the former Shinigami didn't know of the flaw that the medallion held. One could not use Vollständig when in possession of a Bankai, and he could not steal a Bankai if he was in his Vollständig. You're getting on my nerves, Urahara Kazuki. Quilge roared, and unleashed a hail of reishi blasts. There was no precision, nor accuracy in his attacks, but only his intent to crush his enemy. Well, that was enlightening and all, but Kazuki suddenly appeared behind Quilge, and whispered while placing his finger on the back of Quilge's neck. I really must get going, before everything gets out of control. So if you would stay put, Quilge-san, I would be quite grateful. Kazuki's Raryoku blazed throughout the Quincy's body, and 5 lines of light connected his head, hands, and feet in a pentagram. Quilge struggled to move his body, but the Kido didn't even budge. What is this? Well, that would be one of my own personal Kido. It was one of the prototypes I came up with to use on Aizen, but I figured that this one would be my best bet against you, Quilge-san. You see, each time I switched myself with my portable D-guys, I planted the foundations for this Kido. Shibari, Benihime. Kazuki slashed his Zanpakuto, which formed a crimson-red net, which wrapped itself around Quilge. Kazuki wasn't about to stop there. Hyasobi, Benny, sadly, Kazuki didn't get the chance to finish his technique. Enough of this, Quilge roared, and broke himself free from the binding Kido with sheer power. He then simply ripped the net that tried to bind him, and launched himself into the air with his reishi wings. Urahara Kazuki, this is your end. I don't think so, dumbass. A rough voice growled over Quilge, and Quilge quickly retreated with his Floodbildskrit. He realized that he was a little too late. Much to his chagrin, he stared up at his Hylogenshine, which was split clean into half. You, Quilge glared at the blue-haired Arankar, who smirked in return. Figured the disc on your head had something to do with your freaky ability. Looks like I got it right, huh? Who the hell are you, Arankar? Former Sexta Espada, Grimmjow Jagerjackes, he muttered, and stretched his neck. Seriously, can't a guy catch some sleep around here? Quilge's eyes widened for a moment, and narrowed into a slit. I see. Another filthy vermin to put down, then. Huh, who are you calling a vermin, you fucker? Hey, Shinigami, after I deal with this moron, we're going to have a talk about that punk Kurosaki. Grimmjow said over his shoulder. Oh, of course, Grimmjow-san. Whenever you're ready, said Kazuki, his jovial voice returning once more. He quickly retreated, and grabbed a Ryu on his way. Orihime was done patching up Chad, and was now trying to heal the Trace Bestia. Kazuki swept some dust away from his hat, and fixed his gaze on Ryu. Ishida-san, if all of our enemy can use this Volstandig, I won't be able to do anything against them, growled Ryu. He felt useless, like that time when he faced the Manos with Ichigo near 3 years ago. Just like when he tried to stop the Holofeed Ichigo from doing something he might regret over the domes of Las Noches. I'll have to talk with Rukin. He has a lot to answer for. But Urahara-san, do you think the Arankar can deal with him? Well, in case you haven't noticed yet, he can only use his blood in one type at a time. I'm unsure if it is just a way to fool opponents, but if he can't use both, Grimmjow-san will be able to overpower him. Ishida-san, you fought against the Octava Espada, right? Kazuki asked. Ryu nodded to his question. I didn't fight him alone, but yes. Kurosaki-san fought Grimmjow-san and won, using his hollow mask in his Bankai. I'll assume that he is stronger than that time at this point, and an Arankar's physical prowess isn't remotely comparable to Shinigami or Quincy. So his speed will be able to press the Quincy to the point where he cannot shift between his two bloods. The only problem, I think, will be his ability to imprison someone, but he has only used it once. I'm not sure about how it works, or its limits and whatnot. Kazuki explained his theory, observing the ongoing fight between Grimmjow and Quilge. Indeed, Grimmjow was much too fast for Quilge to slip between his bloods, and he was pressed to the point where he had to maintain his blood venet to protect himself from being killed. Die, you vermin, Quilge sneered, releasing multiple blasts of reishi with a slash of his sword. Quilge's expression turned into the one of shock, when Grimmjow didn't even flinch upon taking the blow, and kicked him in his nose, which sent him flying back a good few meters. Quilge snarled, and wiped the blood off his face. That was really lame, punk. And when I say lame, I mean it. Seriously, that all you got? Grimmjow raised one of his eyebrows. A scum like you, is your better. Grimmjow replied in an uncaring manner, a red sphere forming near instantly at his palm. Sero. Quilge snarled at seeing this, and quickly switched to his blood artery. He fired his own reishi blast, expecting it to overpower the Sero. Red and blue collided, resulting in a massive explosion. TCH, lucky bastard. Grimmjow muttered, and brought up his arm to block the reishi sword of the Quincy. You are a hindrance, said Quilge, and fired a reishi blast from point blank. There was another explosion, resulting in a cloud of dust obscuring the whole area. As the dust cleared, the Arrancar and Quincy observed each other from a distance. Grimmjow had small burns on his skin, although they weren't a serious injury. I can penetrate his hierro if I am using my blood artery, but any wounds I receive during that time will prove to be fatal. Quilge thought to himself. He shouldn't have let his guard down. If he still had his Hylogenshine active, he wouldn't have had any problems overpowering the Arrancar, but that was not to be. Not right now, anyway. That bastard, what's it with those damned blasts? The first one barely scratched my hierro, and now he completely overpowered it. Grimmjow growled in annoyance. Grimmjow-san, he has a technique called Blood, which can power up his defensive of offensive abilities. Oh, and it can't be used at the same time. Kazuki yelled from a distance, hiding behind Orihime's Santon Keshun. I didn't need your help, Shinigami, replied Grimmjow, as he rolled his eyes. You're welcome, Grimmjow-san. Kazuki yelled once more, a sly grin threatening to form on his lips. He tried to stop it for his sake, and failed miserably. Grimmjow just proceeded to ignore him, and turned his attention to the Quincy. He drew his blade for the first time after he sliced Quilge's Hylogenshine in half. I'm not in a rush, mind you. But I'd rather take my time with Kurosaki than some pussy like you. Quilge frowned at the insult for a moment, which turned into a smirk. I almost feel sorry for you. You can stare up at the constellations for all you want, but you will never reach it. You'll just end up dead at the flick of his finger. As if, scoffed Grimmjow, I'll crush you, and then make that bastard Kurosaki fall on his knees in front of the real king. Grind, Pantera. Quilge grimaced at the change of the enemy's Reiatsu, as the more beast-like form of Grimmjow showed itself. It became even more violent than it already was, and it became a near-pure hollow Reiatsu instead of the hollow Shinigami hybrid Reiatsu. Resurrection. Hey, Grimmjow smirked as he pounced the Quincy, his claws aimed to kill. Quilge couldn't afford to go on the offensive as Grimmjow's current speed was too fast for him to shift between his blood. If he tried to use his blood artery, his head would drop to the ground in an instant. Not so tough now, yeah, I can see why you think Kurosaki's that much above you. You're pathetically weak. You don't understand anything, Quilge muttered with a chuckle, and instead of backing off to dodge the Arrancar's attacks, he charged in. It was a calculated move, one that might have worked if Grimmjow hadn't released his Zanpakuto. Grimmjow easily read this move, and planted his knee into Quilge's chest. As Quilge gasped, Grimmjow grabbed his neck, and threw him into a pillar. Whatever you say, I don't really care, asshole, said Grimmjow, firing 5 dark green projectiles from his elbow towards the Quincy. It exploded upon making contact, burying him under the debris of the pillar. Grimmjow sealed his Zanpakuto, but didn't sheath it yet. He had loosened his Pesquisa to the point, where he was too late to realize that the fight wasn't over yet. Quilge stood a good few meters behind him with his sword tip aimed at the Arrancar, forcing his body to move beyond its limits with one of the most advanced technique in a Quincy's arsenal, Ranso Tengai. His blood artery was powering him at its limit, a desperate attempt to change the outcome of the battle. When Grimmjow realized that something was wrong, Quilge had already gathered up all of the reishi he needed. Die, you impudent filth. Quilge released the crackling beam of reishi, which engulfed the Arrancar almost as soon as he realized the danger he was in. The reishi beam packed enough force to make Grimmjow let out a scream of agony. Had he maintained his released state, he would have got out of the situation relatively unscathed, but he had sealed his Zanpakuto already. Grimmjow was absolutely livid at the enemy, but at himself at the same time. It wasn't all that easy to sense a Quincy with his Pesquisa in the first place, but he slipped and then made the mistake of sealing his Zanpakuto. There was only one way to make up for this failure he brought on himself, which was destroying the enemy who was responsible for this. He was about to draw up some blood, when he realized that he was covered with more than enough of it. With a swipe of his palm on his bloodied torso, he stretched the now blood-covered arm, and held its forearm with his other hand for support. A bluish sero formed on his palm, waiting impatiently for its release. Gran Rey Sero, Grimmjow yelled with a smirk. As soon as he fired the stronger version of the sero, he disappeared with his Sonito. He didn't expect the Quincy to get caught in his Gran Rey Sero at all. When Quilge moved out of the path of destruction with his Floodbildskrit, he was caught in the chest with a kick from Grimmjow, which sent him flying downwards. Grimmjow disappeared with a buzz, and appeared directly in front of Quilge. Grimmjow grabbed Quilge's head with his hand, nearly crushing the man's skull in the process. "Remember this as you die, Quincy." Grimmjow rolled the word in his mouth with disdain, and whispered. "No one crosses the king, and live another day. A king cannot stand up to an emperor." Quilge retorted with a small chuckle, and coughed up some blood. Quilge knew that he was going to die, but he found himself surprisingly calm about the whole situation. At first, he felt as though he didn't serve His Majesty well enough, and he would have been miserable to his death if it weren't for one person that crossed his mind. Kurosaki Ichigo. With the successor of the emperor on their side, he didn't doubt their chances of winning this war. Whatever. Grimmjow rolled his eyes, and strengthened his grip on the man, intent on crushing his skull. A young man deserving of the title of the future emperor of the Wandenreich, indeed. It was the last thoughts of Quilge as his skull was crushed brutally. At some distance Orihime choked up a sob at the sight, while Ryu turned his head with his eyes closed. Kazuki wasn't overly bothered with the scene, being a former member of the Onmitsukido. Well, he was bothered somewhat with the brutal method of ending the Quincy's life, out of concern for the teenagers that were with him. True, they have been through some of their own unsettling events, but such blatant display of violence wasn't really good for their mental health. "Urahara-san, are you really sure we can trust him? He was our enemy back then, and he well, at least you'll be useful against a fight with him, Ishida-san." Kazuki joked. "That being said, what is your business with Kurosaki-san?" "Yo." Grimmjow smirked as he kicked Yuryu's ass from behind, his hands in his pockets. "Well, Shinigami, ain't that obvious? To kill him, of course. What else would it be? And you really should relax, Four Eyes. No offense, but I'm not interested in a weakling like you." "What was that for?" Ryu yelled indignantly as he got up, and adjusted his glasses. "And I take offense to that, Arankar. Hey, at least you've got the balls, then. What's with all these losers, though? Oh, you're here too, princess." Grimmjow raised his brows as Orihime finished healing the last of the Trace Bestia. "Oh, hi, Grimmjow-san," Orihime answered warily, due to his brutal method of ending Quilge's life. But she was too much of a kind soul to let it stop her from healing an injured person. "Do you want me to heal your injuries?" Grimmjow stared back at the orange-haired girl who was too kind for her own good, and shrugged. If I'm going to fight Kurosaki, might as well fight him in top condition." Orihime nodded, unsure of how to react to his declaration of fighting Ichigo. Normally, she would rather not heal someone who wanted to harm Ichigo, but he did save them from the other Quincy, so. "Soden Kishun, I reject." As Orihime's Shun Rika started to do its job, Grimmjow asked the million-dollar question. "So, where's Kurosaki?" "Most likely Soul Society at the moment," Kazuki scratched the back of his neck and replied. "Apparently, he joined the Quincy, and they're currently invading Soul Society." Wait, what?" Grimmjow let out a dumb sound upon hearing that. "What the hell?" "Well, Kurosaki-san's mother was a Quincy, so it isn't as surprising as you think, really. Since his father never told him that his mother was a Quincy, I'd say that he would have been quite pissed at us." "And what about him?" Grimmjow pointed at Ryu, who scowled in response. "If Kurosaki is with those Quincy, why is he not with them?" Ryu refused to answer Grimmjow's question. Whatever their reasons, it still stung his pride that they didn't bother trying to recruit him. He might have had the chance to foil their plans from the inside, and get his revenge if they did. Grimmjow shrugged at the lack of response, and nodded to Orihime in thanks, which surprised the girl. She didn't think he would actually thank him, really. "Well, what are you waiting for? Might as well kick some Quincy ass till I find the bastard." Grimmjow muttered, opening a garganta. "Oh, and you losers stay here." Neither Pesci or Dondochaka objected, and Nell readily agreed, while Kazuki thought of a project of his own. "Do you have any last words? It is the only mercy I shall willingly grant to a villain." Mask asked, as he held up the gray-haired Shinigami with his neck. "Piss off," Kensai retorted, forming his hollow mask instantly, and snapped Mask's arm. Mask howled in pain, and retreated with his Floodbildskrit. A cowardly move, as expected from the epitome of evil. But heroes, especially a star like me, will never bow down to the likes of you. Quote. Yeah, Mr. will not stop until he purges the world from the evil. I believe in you, superstar. James chipped in. Of course, James, I am overjoyed by your belief in me, the superstar. Mask bellowed, his broken arm functioning as if it was never broken in the first place. He disappeared from the spot, only to appear right above Kensai, and slammed his fist downwards. This is the smite of justice. Mask didn't stop there. He stomped his foot on Kensai repeatedly, each stomp causing the ground in the vicinity to shake mildly. This is the enforcing of justice. Mask nearly screamed each word every time he stomped his foot, and kicked Kensai's side as he finished. Kensai's battered form collided into a wall with his hollow mask crumbling into pieces. Well, it seems that he was just another obstacle on our quest for justice. Maybe we should skip the celebration for our victory, if the enemy was a weak low-class villain. Wouldn't you agree, James? You're right, mister, but I would like to see you count to 10. James chirped. Very well, James. I shall count the numbers, and we shall leave to seek out the more dangerous villains that threatens the peace of the world. 10. Fuck you, and your pathetic mask of heroism. We'll see if you can say the same, when you're about to die. Bankai, Tekken Tachikas. Mask scratched the top of his head with his finger for a moment, and glanced back to James uncertainly. James, was he a captain? I thought only captains were capable of using their Bankai. Yes, the white Haori is only worn by the captains, mister. I see. Mask placed his fingers on his chin to think, and just as Kensai was about to beat the Quincy to a pulp, he pulled out a medallion. But if he cannot use his Bankai, he is nothing more than a mere thug. Mask shook his medallion, and flicked it with his finger in confusion. It wasn't reacting to the enemy's Bankai at all. Did he receive a malfunctioning medallion or something? Don't you ignore me, unless you're that eager to die. Kensai growled, and punched Mask's abdomen. Mask let out a cry of surprise, which turned into a one of agony soon enough. Uig, erga. As Mask slumped down to the ground, Kensai kicked him over on his back, and placed his foot on Mask's chest. My Tachikaze's ability is to cause the path of the blade to explode. In its Bankai form, Tekken Tachikas, the strength of those explosions is concentrated into my fists. As long as you're in contact to my fist, the force of those explosions will continue to assault you, endlessly. Kensai pulled back his fist, and slammed it into Mask's chest. Mask didn't even get to let out a scream of pain, as the explosions disrupted his insides, and ruined it beyond repair. Kensai kept his fist in contact for quite some time, and lifted it when he thought that Mask was probably dead. Seriously though, you should have taken after All Might if you were going to proclaim yourself as a hero. He's way cooler than you. No, don't give in, mister. You can't lose like this, wailed James. Wow, now he's making me feel like I'm really the bad guy here. Kensai deadpanned. Please get back up, superstar. James yelled, and Kensai suddenly had a bad feeling. When Kensai turned his gaze back at where Mask was, there was nothing there. He instantly brought his guard up, only to receive a drop kick to his back. He rolled and bounced on the ground, eventually coming to a stop, sprawled on his back. Mask grabbed Kensai's Haori, and pulled him up, bringing the captain's face close to his own. My designated letter is S. I am the superstar, Mask de Masculine. The cheers of my fans are all the strength I need. And now, embrace your defeat, villain. Star headbutt. Kensai's vision blackened for a moment, and when he opened his eyes he was greeted with Mask's knee to his stomach. Star eagle kick. Goddamn. Kensai coughed up some blood, and slammed his fist into Mask's torso. Don't you get cocky. Mask seemed to let out a groan of pain for a moment, until another cheer was heard from James. After that, Mask easily shrugged the pain off, and grabbed Kensai's head. He slammed him into the ground, resulting in a massive crater around the two. He repeated it a few times, and dropped him to the ground. HMMPH. Even with his Bankai, he was a nothing more than a lowly villain until the end. Now, Let us see if someone needs the help of a hero. Come along, James. Yes, mister. It didn't take long before Rose came upon an unconscious Kensai. Rose let out a sigh of relief when he noticed that Kensai was still breathing, albeit shallow. Rose placed Kensai's arm on his shoulder and carried him off to the 4th Division. Jugram Hashwalt sighed as he flicked the dripping blood off his blade. Killing an opponent who couldn't resist was not something he would usually do in his own conscience, but at the moment Royd was the one making the calls. He could refuse if he found it to be an irrational order, but sadly he did not. End the life of Zaraki Kenpachi. He was lying on the ground in a heap, unconscious, unarmed, waiting for the death blow. As much as the act itself was distasteful to Jugram, he knew that Zaraki Kenpachi was too dangerous to let him live. He also knew that the reason Royd wanted Zaraki Kenpachi to be dead was due to the fact that his own brother had been killed in the captain's hand. And so he did. Zaraki Kenpachi, the special war power, was no more. Zanka no Tachi, North, Tenchi Kaijin, Yamamoto roared. Royd knew that this would be the end for him. As Yamamoto slashed his sword upwards, Royd hoped that His Majesty would recognize his services for the Empire. He could at least rest in peace, knowing that Jugram would have dealt with the one who killed his brother. Hey now, sorry if I'm a little late. Royd's eyes snapped up, as a Sternritter with dark vapor-like wings stood firmly in front of him. He had the hood of his Sternritter cloak lowered, mostly due to the heat caused by the release of Zanka no Tachi. Yamamoto was surprised at the sudden appearance of the former substitute Shinigami. The golden irises which stood out from the black sclera in his eyes shone with power, and the dark vapor-like wings reminded everyone near the area of the final Getsuga Tensho. There was a black crown with 5 protrusions on his head, the Heiligenschein of his Vollständig, not that Yamamoto recognized it by any means. Despite his appearance, Yamamoto doubted that the young boy would survive his most powerful attack. His willingness to protect his leader was admirable, but Yamamoto also didn't believe that Yhwach would appreciate his sacrifice even if the father of Quincy lived through it. He truly was a cruel man, after all. Yamamoto didn't think that the boy would be able to negate his Tenchi Kaijin, unlike when he was able to stop the flames of his Shikai. He expected both the boy and Yhwach to fall in this single strike. Heiliger Blitz. If anything, Yamamoto was not expecting a pure white Sero from a Quincy. He most certainly did not expect it to be so powerful, that the very space near the boy would distort from it. Even then, he still didn't believe it to be capable of matching his Tenchi Kaijin, much less overpower it. He was soon proved to be wrong. The white Sero collided with the single slash that contained the flames and heat of Zanka no Tachi, and it seemed to be overpowered by the concentrated flames at first. Yamamoto narrowed his eyes when the Sero flashed, and kept on holding its own against the flames. He noticed that the Sero had started to diminish, just as the flames were about to be extinguished. Somehow, Kurosaki Ichigo had blocked his most powerful attack in his Bankai. Worry not, Sternritter Kurosaki. You were right on time. Royd muttered in gratitude. You should return to Silburn for medical attention. I'll take it from here. Ichigo replied, and formed a Heilig Bogen. It was neither his usual reishi weapons, but a bow that looked like it was made out of dark vapor. I've been itching to have a go at the old man ever since I met him in his office. Very well, I wish you good luck. Yamamoto leveled his glare on Ichigo, as he digested the current situation. Somehow, it looked like Yhwach was taking orders from the Kurosaki boy. Just what exactly was going on? I can see that you're confused, but you really shouldn't be, said Ichigo. Yamamoto narrowed his eyes at the former ally, now enemy of the Soul Society. Because if you don't focus properly on the fight, I just might end up killing you on accident. Insolent brat, Yamamoto growled. Maybe I did word it a little arrogantly. Ichigo admitted, but then again, it really wasn't arrogance if he was just stating the truth. But I still stick with my words. If you are so eager to be burnt to ashes, then so be it. Yamamoto growled, as he advanced on the Sternritter. As the giant prison of ice shattered, the unconscious form of Hitsugaya Toshiro dropped to the ground. A grievously injured Yukatake Jashiro sighed and sheathed his Zanpakuto, and picked up the young captain along with his buxom lieutenant. He coughed up some blood, but ignored the dizziness and kept on moving towards the 4th Division. He briefly wondered if they could win this war, before the head captain burns the Soul Society to ashes himself. If one thing was certain, the situation was not going well for the Soul Society. Not at all. Chapter 10. The Embers of an Era. Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni was an old man, even in soul standards. While souls aged differently from humans, they still grew old over time. Despite how much he had honed his Bankai over the years ever since the first war against the Quincy, his body wasn't what it used to be. But that didn't mean that he expected himself to have a hard time fighting against this upstart. Kurosaki Ichigo hadn't even reached the age of 20, while he was well over 2000. If it was any other, he would have crushed his opponent with his Reiatsu alone. He could only grunt as he parried the reishi arrows of the young Quincy with his Zanpakuto, quite surprised at the power behind each of them. He had plenty of experience fighting against Quincy from the first war. The power behind the arrows of the Quincy tended to be weak, and mediocre at best when they were trying to overwhelm their enemies with the quantity of the arrows. But the arrows of this child held both quality and quantity, which was a trait he had seen from only the very best of Yhwach's subordinates, and Yhwach himself. It seems that you have lost the little amount of dignity you had, if you have abandoned your Zanpakuto for this mockery. Ichigo raised an eyebrow at this, and chuckled, while continuing to fire more arrows. Dignity. I am a Quincy, old man. I was born as one, and I am proud to be one. As for abandoning my Zanpakuto, you can accuse me all you want. But Zangetsu is always with me, even at this moment. Blasphemy! Roared Yamamoto as he stomped his foot to the ground. Flames erupted from the fissures that had opened up from the act and engulfed the reishi arrows, dissolving them into nothingness. Licked region, Ichigo muttered, and bombarded the head captain with hundreds of vapory reishi arrows. The process of gathering enough reishi for this did not take long, thanks to his Vollständig. He then used a combination of Sonido and Flugbildskrit, and fired a concentrated blast of reishi from the opposite direction. Let's see how you deal with this, old man. Yamamoto wasn't impressed. He swung his Zanpakuto with narrowed eyes, and split the reishi blast in half with ease. The following explosion completely destroyed everything to the old Shinigami's both sides, but it didn't affect Yamamoto in any way. Ichigo's eyebrows quirked when he noticed that the head captain didn't seem to care about his Heilig files, which would have been more than enough to seriously injure a captain-level Shinigami if they were to ignore it like him. Of course, the head captain knew that fully well, and he wasn't a fool. Ichigo watched the scene with fascination, as his Heilig files were incinerated instantly when they came into a certain vicinity of the ancient Shinigami. There wasn't anything that could be seen in his vision, but he could easily take a guess. With the drastic rise in the temperature of the whole Seraiti, the fact that Yamamoto's Bankai was the cause of the intense heat surrounding him was quite obvious. The temperature of a flame was highest at its center, so it wasn't surprising that his Heilig files weren't enough to reach the head captain. So a low-powered licked region won't be enough to overpower his defensive ability, but my Heilig file at its full power probably could. There must be a reason he did parry my Heilig files at first, so I just need to find out its limit. That was good, because it meant that if he poured more power into his attacks, Yamamoto's defensive abilities wouldn't be capable of negating them. Well, it could, if Yamamoto was actually trying to lure him into believing that he needed to block some of his more powerful moves, for the purpose of catching him off guard. However, he could deal with that as long as he stayed aware of the possibility. The scorching heat was growing more intense with every passing second. Ichigo wondered if the head captain's Bankai could actually burn the whole Soul Society to ashes at this rate, but he waved the thought away. It wasn't his problem, really, but then again, he did find the thought to be amusing. The head captain of the Gote 13, bringing the end of Soul Society with his own Bankai. Amusing, and somewhat terrifying at the same time. Do you think I would be doing you guys a favor, if I stopped you from wielding your Bankai? Asked Ichigo, as he poured more power into each reishi arrow to test the limit of Yamamoto's defense. I mean, how long would it take for your Bankai to set the whole Seraiti on flames? Your concern is unwarranted, child. It wouldn't take that long for me to give you a proper beating, said Yamamoto. He lowered his stance and dashed towards Ichigo at an alarming speed, not even using his shunpo. Chips of stone flew into the air from the small crater that had formed, due to the sheer power of Yamamoto when he launched himself. Now, I shall see if you can back your earlier words of arrogance. The heat that radiated from the Zanpakuto left a burnt-open trail on Ichigo's cloak when the tip of the blade caught it, causing Ichigo to frown at the expense of his favorite cloak. He noted that he should be careful to avoid any direct contact with the tip of the blade, since it was obvious that it wouldn't be a pleasant experience for him. Ichigo effortlessly weaved through the aggressive slashes of Zenka no Tachi, and fired a few Reiatsu blasts of his own while gradually increasing the power in his Hylic files to keep on testing the limits of Yamamoto's defense. It was holding its own fairly well so far, but Ichigo knew that he could get through it eventually. "When will you draw your blade, boy?" asked Yamamoto, his blade adding another scorched line on the ground. "I hope that you are not under the impression that you'll be able to defeat me with those arrows of yours. You would end up disappointed." Ichigo shrugged, and threw a punch at the old man's face. Yamamoto sent a pitying look at Ichigo, fully expecting his arm to burn into nothingness from making direct contact with his Zanjutsu Gokui. His eyes widened when Ichigo's fist actually connected with his jaw, causing him to stagger a few steps backwards. Ichigo couldn't hold back a smirk from forming when he saw the expression on the head captain's face. "Did you earn your spot as the head captain with your words? You keep bringing up my arrogance, but how about yours? If you keep up with that attitude you'll end up regretting it, I can assure you that." How is it that you were not affected by my Zanjutsu Gokui? Once my Bankai is released, both my body and blade bear the heat of the sun itself. Your arm should not have left anything, not even a pile of ash. And yet, Yamamoto trailed off, visibly shaken when he saw that Ichigo was able to negate another part of his Bankai. "Well, that's just bullshit. If it actually held the heat of the sun, your precious soul society would become an inferno in an instant, not over time. Besides, that's for me to know and you to find out," Ichigo replied nonchalantly, and then formed a reishi sword with a frown. It was a solid construct, and yet had the vapor-like appearance which was the same as his Hylic Bogan. "But I suppose I'll spare you the headache, since it would be a bit too cruel of me to do that. Especially to an old man who won't live to see the end of this day." Flames erupted and sparks flared when the two swords clashed, and the ground cracked under the overwhelming spiritual pressure released from the duo. Yamamoto narrowed his eyes in annoyance that Ichigo's sword did not succumb to his Bankai, and growled. "Your arrogance knows no bounds, boy. Seeing that my reishi sword can hold its own against your Bankai, I'd say it's more than enough proof of it being self-confidence, not arrogance, old man. And didn't I say that you're going to regret it if you keep doing that? As I was about to say, as Quincy have a technique which is the equivalent to a Shinigami's Bankai. The Quincy, Vollständig, which is what I am using at the moment. I won't bother saying which is superior and whatnot, but my Vollständig is unique. Simply put, my Vollständig includes some of the traits of an Arrancar's Resurrection." It didn't surprise Yamamoto as much as it should have, due to the prior knowledge he had about Ichigo's inner hollow. That didn't mean he wasn't surprised at all, though. A hybrid of Shinigami and hollow was one thing, but a hybrid of Quincy and hollow. It completely went against the very nature of the world, even more so than the former. As different as they are, Shinigami and hollows were still souls, a different page on the same book. Quincy's, they were still very much alive, making them different pages on a completely different book. Yamamoto quickly pushed the irrelevant thoughts away, and focused on the task of bringing down the wayward son of Isshin. He had to admit that this child was proving himself to be a competent enough foe, just enough to admit that even he was unsure if he could defeat the boy before his Bankai burnt down the whole Seraiti, and even himself. Although Ichigo seemed to be holding his own fairly well, he knew that Yamamoto was still stronger than him in the physical aspect. Yamamoto was an old war-hardened Shinigami, and he was still a human. Yes, a hybrid of hollow, Shinigami, and Quincy, but still a human in nature. Yamamoto's strikes were powerful, straightforward, but it did not lack finesse. Ichigo mostly focused on parrying the head captain's Zanpakuto, while occasionally slipping his own counters. The ancient Shinigami had become wary of his deadly counter-attacks, having been almost caught in some of those. If his skills were still the same as the time when he was a substitute Shinigami, he would have blindly went in for the offensive in order to overpower his opponent. But Ichigo learned to be better, knew how to be better, and became better than that. He had improved vastly over the last year, and it was proven by the fact that while Yamamoto seemed to be pushing him into defensive, Ichigo had not even once allowed a clean strike on himself. Just because he honed his swordsmanship with Jugram didn't mean that his style had become the polar opposite of his original style, though. Zangetsu would have none of it, and Ichigo himself didn't want that either. So he made a compromise with his two Zanpakuto spirits. He would deal with the more detailed parts of his fight with his instincts, but also control the whole picture with a bit more strategic mind, as expected from a Quincy. The answer to your question earlier is high-speed regeneration, powered up with my Vollständig. Basically, my regeneration speed is just extremely fast, so that I regenerated everything before the heat of your Bankai could actually incinerate the entirety of my arm, answered Ichigo, blocking another heavy strike from the head captain. You really should have let Inoue heal your arm, you know. You would have had a better chance that way. Before Yamamoto could retort, he felt a deep gash opening over his torso, and quickly stepped back some distance. Somehow he had lost the boy from his senses for a short moment, which resulted in a near-fatal wound. It could have actually killed him if he reacted even a millisecond later than he had. Yamamoto had no idea how this happened, nor did he have any kind of speculations. It just happened, for the lack of a better description. When I fought as a Shinigami, I fought for my life at the best of my abilities, learned to use some shunpo, and gained the resolve to never back down in order to protect my precious people. Obviously, the last one was the most important thing. Then I learned to fight with my instincts from my inner hollow, to enjoy the act of fighting itself, even if I didn't admit it at that time. When I not only learned my heritage as a Quincy, but became one. Ichigo trailed off, thinking of everything he had learned. Another gash opened up from Yamamoto's side, a second one on his only arm, and the third on his back. Yamamoto growled in annoyance, and concentrated on his senses to its limit. When he felt a presence nearing, he stomped his foot onto the ground, and flames erupted from the fissures that had opened up. When he lost the presence once more, Ichigo was in front of him, his sword stabbing into his flesh. Yamamoto gasped, and tried to move, only to find his body not responding to his will. I learned proper swordsmanship, archery, Flugbildskrit, reishi manipulation, probably everything I could learn with the exception of old Quincy spells. I learned to keep a level head, think ahead, and to fight efficiently. Despite all that, a part of me rather likes to drag my fight longer than necessary if my opponent is as good as you, a bit too much like Kenpachi if you ask me. So I'll humor you a little. My Schrift, the ability His Majesty granted to a Sternritter through sharing his blood is, the amnesia. As of this moment, I effectively made your brain forget to send out certain signals to most of your body, so it won't be able to order your body to move for a short time. It will take a lot of effort, but I can make it permanent if I want it to be. Don't worry though, this will only hold for a few minutes. Ichigo then added with a thoughtful expression. Oh, right, you can still talk, by the way. What is the meaning of this? Growled Yamamoto. Wasn't I obvious enough? I decided to humor you a little, that's all. As I said, a part of me enjoys a good fight, and there aren't many that can give me a fight like you. So, back to what I was saying. My Schrift, the amnesia, can make someone or something to forget what I want them to. You may have, or may not have noticed that your former 2nd Division captain is still very much alive. I made her forget her loyalty to the Gote, and she didn't have that much of a high opinion on you guys after that. Impossible. Even Yhwach cannot grant a power of such caliber through his blood. He is no god. It wasn't the old man's denial, but actually the fact. Ichigo knew that such power was above what Yhwach could offer to his Sternritter, but his was not the same as the others. If Yhwach decided to do so, he could easily retrieve the power he gave out to his children with his Oswalin. In Ichigo's case, Yhwach had to put a hell lot of effort to steal his powers, not just strike him with the Oswalin to instantly strip him off of it. Well, you're right, but I'm an anomaly. My very existence goes against every single one of your belief, after all, shrugged Ichigo. He hummed for a moment, and spoke up. I could end this fight in a single moment, and it wouldn't take that much of an effort. As much as you would want to deny it, you made a big mistake in not asking Inoue to heal your other arm. And, utterly preposterous, roared Yamamoto. Angry dark red flames lit up the sky, and the entirety of the Seraiti could see the flames that had been released along with the furious Reiatsu of the head captain. Why am I not surprised? Ichigo muttered while fanning himself with his hand, a good distance away from the head captain. Somehow Yamamoto had overpowered his shrift, and nearly caught him in his deadly attack. It wasn't as powerful as his Tenchi Kaijin, but any kind of attack with his Bankai was more than capable of seriously injuring even Yhwach himself. There was a reason Yhwach didn't want to face Yamamoto's Bankai directly, when his power of the Almighty had yet to fully awaken, not that he was afraid of Yamamoto by any means. It wasn't that Yhwach felt threatened by the head captain, but more of a cautious measure to not stunt the recovery of his powers. Another burst of flames destroyed a wide area to Ichigo's left, when he parried the visibly more vicious strike of the head captain. It led him to the realization that he was being treated to the glimpse of the Yamamoto from the first war. It felt like he was a completely different person in comparison to moments earlier. His attacks were much more aggressive, malicious, and full of murderous intent. Ichigo had to step back when Yamamoto stomped his foot right in front of him, and lowered his body, which spun around 180 degrees. Figures that the old man would be well versed in Hakuda, and most likely in Kido as well. Ichigo quickly ducked, not wanting to get his head caught in such a destructive reverse roundhouse kick, Yamamoto's heel whizzing over his head. Even the flames of his Bankai became more volatile, evident from the storm of flames that followed after the kick. Ichigo was forced to put some distance between Yamamoto and himself, due to the much more violent heat Yamamoto's Zanpakuto radiated. While he wouldn't be burnt to a crisp, instant regeneration did take its toll on his Raryoku reserves, however vast it may be. When Yamamoto's kick had failed to connect with his opponent along with the following attack, he buried the blade of Zenka no Tachi into the ground and chanted. "Lifeless bodies, ashes of those who have perished by my flame, lend me your aid. I shall grant you the brief pleasure of battle once more. Zenka no Tachi, South. Kaka Jumanokushi Daisojin." As the charred hands of the skeletal corpses arose from the numerous fissures that had opened up from the ground, Ichigo took advantage of the wings of his Vollständig, and brought himself up high into the air. He was briefly aware of what those corpses were capable of, having seen them in action just before he intervened in the fight between Royd and Yamamoto. While a whole army of undead soldiers would prove to be quite bothersome against some, they really weren't of any threat to him. There weren't any corpses that Yamamoto's Bankai could bring back to affect his mentality in a negative way, effectively restricting the effects of the technique to pure physical means. What can they actually do, now that I'm high up in the air, out of their reach? Thought Ichigo, only to regret those words afterwards. When Ichigo saw one of the corpses flying at him, he didn't really know what to think of it. He flicked his sword out of reflex, and cleaved the corpse clean in half. As much as he wanted to say otherwise, Ichigo was confused as hell. It wasn't until he noticed a whole squad of black skeletal soldiers approaching him rapidly, that he figured out how they were flying. They were throwing one another at him, which would have been somewhat hilarious if he wasn't their target. Ichigo mechanically cut them down, while keeping an eye on Yamamoto to ensure that he wasn't caught off guard. Despite the act he had put on, Yamamoto knew that he couldn't simply overpower the upstart in his current condition. He had broke himself free from the Sternritter's shrift at the expense of his Raryoku, and the amount it cost him was nothing to scoff at. He had paid for his arrogance, and he didn't intend to repeat his earlier mistake. Kurosaki Ichigo was an opponent he needed to take seriously, and the thought sent a cold shiver up his spine. No one, not even Yhwach in the First War, had made him feel like this. Granted, he knew that his age was catching up to him, and his overall strength wouldn't be able to match himself during the First War. His current power while using Bankai was stronger than that of his younger self, but he knew that he was running out of time. The rather large amount of Raryoku he had lost to negate the child's ability took its toll, and it wouldn't be long before he actually burnt himself to ashes at this rate. "You shouldn't drop your guard like that, old man." Yamamoto's eyes snapped open in surprise, and quickly used Shunpo to escape from whatever Ichigo was about to do. It turned out to be a wise choice on his part. A dark red wave of concentrated reishi carved a path of destruction on the grounds of the Seraiti, destroying several buildings in its way along with the majority of the charred skeletons. But what really unnerved the ancient Shinigami wasn't the power behind the attack. Why was I unable to sense you? Growled Yamamoto, his irritation showing from his narrowed eyes. He couldn't understand how Ichigo was able to catch him off guard so easily, and multiple times at that, not when he could sense the immense Raryoku radiating from the boy. I admit that you're fast, much more so than even myself. But that itself is not enough to slip from my senses with such ease. Ichigo hummed in response, contemplating on whether he should humor Yamamoto once more, or not. He knew that regardless of his choice, the outcome of this fight was sealed from the start. Even now, he could just rob the head captain of his Bankai, which would result in a rather one-sided victory for him. Even if he somehow lost, he knew that he could stall enough time for His Majesty to intervene. Are you sure you want to know the answer? I mean, I wouldn't want you to lose all your hope in winning, since it would be kind of lame. The only reason I'm fighting you is that I thought it would be fun. Had I not been interested, you would be dead right now, said Ichigo, trying to rile up Yamamoto on purpose. If he was going to expose one of his secrets, he wanted to make sure that Yamamoto would still give him his all. More likely than not, Yamamoto would fight him until his last breath if he kept on fueling his anger. And in all honesty, it was the truth. If he didn't want to take a shot at the head captain, His Majesty would have easily dealt with him at this point instead of him. Do not get cocky, you insolent brat. Sure, whatever you say, Ichigo replied with a cheeky smirk. I wasn't lying when I said that our Vollständig was pretty much the equivalent of Bankai, you know. And what would you know of Bankai, child? Your Bankai was. Yeah, I know that my Bankai wasn't all that impressive by your standards and all. But it wasn't all that bad in my opinion, if you consider the fact that it was my foe Zanpakuto's Bankai, said Ichigo while interrupting Yamamoto's speech, earning another death glare from the ancient Shinigami's narrowed eyes. Ichigo scowled in annoyance at the old man's attitude. If you don't want to believe it, that's fine by me. Just know that my Bankai and hollow mask, and everything, all of it was a mere shade of my current strength. Nonsense. A foe Zanpakuto, you say? There's no such thing as a foe Zanpakuto, scoffed Yamamoto. I doubt that you'd know better than my own Zanpakuto, Ichigo muttered dryly, looking down upon the head captain. Anyway, there is a considerable boost in our abilities while in our Vollständig state. Complete domination over foreign reishi is one of them, and the amplification of our shrift is another one. You were able to sense me, old man. Don't get me wrong. One moment, Yamamoto was glaring at the orange-haired Quincy from some distance. The next, the distance became non-existent. You just forgot, Ichigo said in the distorted voice of his hollow counterpart, which sent unpleasant shivers up Yamamoto's spine. When he saw the reflection of himself in the Sternritter's cold golden eyes, Yamamoto realized that everything this boy had said during their fight was in fact, the truth. As a blast of reishi struck his chest, he grudgingly admitted that the boy could have killed him earlier in the battle, while he was unaware of the opponent's capabilities. The head captain was sent flying from the blast with a stream of blood trickling down his chin, but regained his composure midair on his own. You have proved yourself to be too much of a danger to the Soul Society, said Yamamoto, and suddenly swung his Zanpakuto in an arc. Ichigo scowled when his reishi sword was stopped in its track, realizing that Yamamoto had somehow found a way to counter his shrift. I shall put you down, as it is my duty to protect the Seraiti. Even at the cost of my own life. Ichigo's scowl morphed into an excited grin upon hearing that. Despite how much Yamamoto was proving himself to be a more dangerous foe than his initial thoughts, Ichigo was actually pleased with the development. The way the most powerful Shinigami of the Gotei 13's Reiatsu exploded, and let its presence known to the whole Seraiti was exhilarating to him. He could practically hear Zangetsu cackling with glee, obviously of the same mind as his wielder. He knew that there would be a boost in morale to the majority of the Shinigami, and it would be expected of him to finish his fight soon. But as long as Yamamoto gave him his all, he was perfectly content with the way this fight was heading. I suppose it's my turn to ask a question. How did you sense my attack? Asked Ichigo, and his grin did not go unnoticed by the head captain. It was not I that sensed it, replied Yamamoto, trading strike after strike with the upstart. Every single one of his strikes were intended to kill, even more vicious than before. It was my body itself that reacted to your blade, now that I have allowed my body to move on its own. I have gone through countless battles in my earlier days, and my body remembers each and every one of it. All it did was to merely react on its own accord, when it sensed your killing intent. Ichigo nodded in response, understanding what the old man meant. It was somewhat similar to his instinctual way of fighting, so he wasn't unfamiliar with the concept, at least. Granted, Yamamoto was well above him in that aspect if what he said was the truth, but that was to be expected with the difference in their experiences. Well, then I should enjoy myself while it lasts. Flames and sparks erupted when their blades connected, and Ichigo found himself lost in the exhilarating sensation of a battle against one of the most powerful beings in existence. Neither of the two backed down, and kept their ground as the sounds of their blades clashing resonated with their heartbeat. The ground underneath them cracked from the immense spiritual pressure, and they found themselves immediately engaged in another duel on the rooftops of the nearby buildings. This time Ichigo did not restrict himself to the defensive, but actively sent his own strikes with the intent to kill. If he wasn't in his Vollständig state, his hollow mask would have formed on his own with all the killing intent he was letting loose. The rooftop of the building cracked and collapsed as he lunged at Yamamoto, and Ichigo swiped his sword at the head captain's throat. Yamamoto held firm as he blocked the strike with his one and only arm, and pushed the Quincy back with all his might, which caused an opening on Ichigo's part. Just as Yamamoto was about to take advantage of the opening, he flinched while lowering his blade to guard his lower body. The sound of metal clashing against one another reverberated, and Ichigo curled his lips. He paid no mind to the fact that Yamamoto had once more reacted to his shrift, and black started to light up the blade of his sword. The head captain's eyes widened upon recognizing the technique from the nature of its Reiatsu, but Ichigo's Sero formed abnormally fast, even faster than the top three of Aizen's Espada. Sero Oscuras. Black split the sky of the Seraiti, but Yamamoto held firm even upon taking a clean hit from the more powerful version of the Sero. Ichigo knew that his Gran Rei Sero would have dealt a lot more damage, and his Heiliger Blitz might have been able to finish the fight at that instant. But the best he could afford while catching Yamamoto off guard was a Sero Oscuras, since he needed to prepare his blood in the case of Gran Rei Sero, and Reishi with Heiliger Blitz. Yamamoto was mostly unharmed even with taking a point-blank hit with Sero Oscuras, but the upper part of his Shihakusho had been destroyed without a trace, exposing his marred upper body with various scars he had earned over the years. There were some burns here and there, but Ichigo knew that he would need something more powerful to induce serious harm with the old man's Zanjutsu Gokui active. The defensive technique of the old man's Bankai was proving to be quite the nuisance, greatly limiting Ichigo's options. He found himself at a disadvantage in close combat, thanks to the head captain's Zanjutsu Gokui. His own stamina was rapidly declining due to the excruciating heat of Zenka no Tachi, not to mention the toll of his own Vollständig. Then again, Ichigo had been conveniently ignoring it until now, but there was actually a time limit to this invasion. He had been stretching it to its limit, but he would have to end this soon, regardless of how much he enjoyed it. And, well, I suppose I can't keep His Majesty waiting any longer. Ichigo sighed inwardly at the thought of cutting this fight short, but maybe he had become a little too much like Kenpachi to his liking. His eyes met with Jugram's, who stood at some distance, and conceded that he had enough of his fun. I'm sorry to say this, but I'll have to cut this short. As much as I've been enjoying our fight, I'm rather behind my schedule. So, yeah, said Ichigo, and raised himself up into the air with his wings. Those are some bold words, child, Yamamoto muttered, his steely gaze focused on the young Quincy, who now had his vapor-like wings stretched out to its fullest with his reishi sword raised high above his head. Several buildings nearby started to dissolve into reishi, and several trails of reishi flowed towards Ichigo, which was soon absorbed into his reishi sword. As Ichigo pressed more and more pure reishi into the blade of his sword, Yamamoto instinctively realized that this would be his last stand. Whether he would emerge victorious or not, he did not know, but he knew that this was where he would have to give his all for the sake of the Seraiti. Soon enough, every single structure in the vicinity became nothing more than a stream of reishi, making its way to the blade of the Sternritter. The light it emitted was so bright and pure, unlike what Yamamoto had seen from his opponent until now, which could be considered as a little more tainted, so to speak. Now standing firmly on the ground, Yamamoto shifted his posture, and prepared for the inevitable. He started to pour his all into his trusted companion for more than a millennia. Not only his Raryoku, but his will to protect the Seraiti, the intent to crush everything that stood in his way, even his own life if needed be. Zanka no Tachi, North. At that moment, the attention of every last sentient being in the Seraiti was focused on the outcome of this battle. The temperature spiked up drastically, eliciting worried glances from the elder captains all over the Seraiti. They knew that if their head captain was actually hard-pressed to this point, the situation was nowhere near being good. Just as Yamamoto's Zanpakuto prepared to strike with the most powerful move in his arsenal, Ichigo brought down his sword in a mighty slash, and a blinding light flashed across the sky of the Seraiti. Lichtschneider. Yamamoto didn't even bat an eye upon witnessing the massive wave of reishi, and swung his Zanpakuto in an arc. Tenchi Kaijin. Both Quincy and Shinigami thought that it would be a repeat of the earlier clash at first, upon seeing how neither of the attacks could overpower each other. They were soon proven wrong, when the concentrated heat and flames cleaved through the wave of reishi a few moments later. Yamamoto couldn't laugh, even though his attack would reach its target without a doubt. The wave of reishi was now split into two, but it was still on its way to the intended target, namely him. He tried his best to move his body away from the path of destruction, but his body did not budge. It seemed that both of them would suffer a devastating blow from their respective opponent. Still, if he was successful in bringing down his opponent with him, then he had done what was needed to be done. The light of destruction approached Yamamoto in an excruciatingly slow speed to his eyes, but it eventually made contact, soon followed by a devastating explosion. All Yamamoto could see in his sight was pure white, and he felt the pain spreading all over his body in an instant. His skin was severely burnt from the heavily concentrated reishi, accompanied with angry red blisters that had formed all over his body. Zanka no Tachi slipped from his grip and fell to the ground, embedding itself into it due to the heat of the blade. The Bankai of the most powerful fire-type Zanpakuto in existence reverted back into its Shikai form, and then into its sealed state. The temperature dropped instantly upon the rather forcible sealing of Zanka no Tachi, and all of the evaporated vapor in the atmosphere started to descend back to the ground in its liquid form. The whole Seraiti realized at that moment that the very outcome they had been dreading became a reality. Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni had lost in combat. Yamamoto blinked in confusion when he felt the droplets of water pelting his body, and tried to move, only to find it not responding to his will. It took a few moments for everything to come back to him, but he realized soon enough that he had lost his consciousness after his battle. Now the question was, how long was he out? He didn't have a solid answer to that particular question, but seeing that he was still very much alive, it couldn't have been that long. Yamamoto doubted that any of the enemy would have let him be, if he had been unconscious for any more than a few minutes, if not less. He released a growl of annoyance as he tried to move his body once more, to find only the upper part of his body responding. Even then, it didn't move as well as he expected it to, which irritated him to no end. Despite all that, Yamamoto knew that he probably got the better part of the deal. His Tenchi Kaijin had split the reishi attack of his enemy, and he doubted that the young boy would have gotten out of it alive, much less unscathed. He himself didn't have the time to react accordingly to the aftermath of the clash between their techniques, and he suspected that it would have been the same for the Quincy. Surely there must be a limit to his high-speed regeneration if he tried to avoid direct contact with his Zanjutsu Gokui. His eyes wandered on the scenery around him, but all Yamamoto could see was the crater he was lying at the center of, and nothing more. There was no trace of the young Quincy, and "It seems that my son has dealt with you as he had proclaimed, Yamamoto." Yamamoto froze upon hearing the satisfied voice of Yhwach, and immediately searched for his Zanpakuto, only to growl in fury when he spotted his trusted weapon in the hands of the Quincy Emperor. He dared to lay his hand on Ryujin Jaka. "Yhwach. Ah, yes, your Zanpakuto. I shall return it to you in due time, but I would like a small chat between ourselves. You see, you were never meant to fight Ichigo. I had originally planned to intervene during you and my substitute's duel, and steal your Bankai before ending your life. Alas, Ichigo wished to have a fight with you badly after your display of power in your office, so I had a little change in my plans. I must say, I am rather impressed at how much your Bankai became stronger over the years. However, you yourself on the other hand, have grown weaker. As much as Yamamoto wanted to say otherwise, he knew that it was the truth. His old self wouldn't have cared about his pride in whatsoever, and practically ordered the human girl into restoring his arm. Ignoring the fact that his old self was no protector in nature, he knew that his old self would have been more successful in protecting the Seraiti compared to his current self. I can see that you feel nothing for the loss of your so-called son, as expected. Yamamoto murmured, not having enough strength to speak in his usual strong and firm authoritative voice. Even after he saved your life, and bought you the time to recover. Yhwach raised his eyebrow, and sent a questioning look at the fallen form of the head captain, only to let out a chuckle moments later. Ah, so you were thoroughly fooled by Sternritter Lloyd, then. I was never here fighting you, Yamamoto. I never was, said Yamamoto, now openly laughing. While Yhwach didn't intend to mock the head captain with this act at first, he found himself enjoying the situation. The Yhwach you fought was not I, but one of the Sternritter who merely took the form of myself on my orders. I made a visit to your empty division, or rather what's under it. Sadly, he didn't accept my offer, but it matters not in the end. The Emperor's laughter only grew in volume when Yhwach saw Yamamoto's eyes widen in disbelief. But as much as he enjoyed mocking the old fossil, they needed to end this invasion before their time was up. He would retire to Silburn for the time being with his advisor after that, and he along with his Jugram would solidify their future plans to secure their victory at the end. As for the loss of my son, why would I mourn for a loss I had yet to suffer, one that would likely never happen? Said Yhwach, an amused expression on his face. He had to admit, he could spend an endless amount of time just toying with Yamamoto, and never get bored of it. It was just too bad for him that he did not have the time to spare for some more entertainment. Ichigo, you did well, my son. I find myself to be impressed at the progress of your Reishi manipulation, or rather Raryoku manipulation. Yamamoto's eyes were plagued with despair when he noticed that his opponent was alive and well, as he landed gracefully alongside Yhwach. Ichigo was no longer in his Vollständig state, and he wasn't wearing his cloak due to it being burnt to a crisp. His uniform was not that different from the standard Sternritter uniform, although he wore a black shirt with a thin red cross on it under his coat, instead of the white and blue like the others. The remaining sleeve of his coat was trimmed with gold, and his belts were black with a golden belt buckle. While I am flattered, did you really expect any less, Your Majesty? Asked Ichigo with a twitch in one of his eyebrows. No, I suppose not. I hope you enjoyed the experience, seeing how it was traded with the chance of obtaining Zenka no Tachi in our hands. You would have ordered me to steal it, if it was truly necessary to secure our victory in this war. Ichigo pointed out dryly. Fair enough. Send word to the Sternritter, Grand Master. It is time to decimate the Soul Society. Ichigo, please give my word to Sternritter Gewel that I require her assistance. Yamamoto let out a wheezing breath upon hearing Yhwach's orders. He had failed to protect the Soul Society from its invaders, and he knew that they now had little to no chance of stopping this invasion on their own. The Zero Division showed no sign of interfering yet, so it would be up to the remaining captains to protect and salvage what is left of the Gotei 13 until they chose to. They had already lost one of their best fighters, the whole R&D department, and now he was about to meet his own demise. Could he trust the young captains and his pupil to protect the Soul Society? He had fallen in battle against one of Yhwach's subordinates, and the said Quincy could have defeated him earlier on with ease if he had used his shrift more actively. Who would be able to stop the former substitute Shinigami, much less the Quincy Emperor himself? Yes, Your Majesty, chorused the two Sternritter, and left the Emperor to himself with the head captain who was no longer considered to be a threat. Yhwach turned his gaze to the battered form of the head captain, and rubbed his chin. He had originally intended to completely destroy the body of Yamamoto after stealing the man's Bankai, Zenka no Tachi. But he knew that the man was in no condition to use his Bankai, and they wouldn't be able to steal it without the man releasing it. It was of no consequence, though. The alternative plan for this situation was made as soon as he granted Ichigo's request to fight Yamamoto on his own. Why would they need to steal the man's Bankai, when they could make him their puppet after his death? Granted, He needn't to die in order to be turned into one of Sternritter, Giselle Gewell's zombies. There was a reason the head captain must die, though. If somehow the Shinigami found a way to revert the effects of the Shrift, the zombie, there was no doubt that Yamamoto would become much more dangerous than he was during his fight against Ichigo. He wouldn't hesitate to ask the help of the Inoue Orihime in order to restore himself back to full condition, or even force the girl into doing so. Normally, he would have dealt with the potential threat accordingly. Meaning that he would give out an order to one of his Sternritter to kill the girl who had the ability to reject reality. Alas, he wouldn't do that to someone his son considered as a friend, at least for the time being, so the other choice was obvious. If Yamamoto was dead before Giselle used her Shrift, the possibility would become non-existent. Simple as that. The zombie wouldn't be as strong as it was before it died, but he'd rather not take any chances when his almighty had yet to awaken. You are going to kill me, Yamamoto wheezed out. Indeed, Yamamoto closed his eyes, and thought of all the events in his life that led to this very moment. He wouldn't say that he regretted any of his actions. He lived by his beliefs, and he would be a fool to have any doubts or regrets over his life he chose to live. What if I had accepted the girl's help? What if I had made sure that Yhwach was dead 1,000 years ago? He knew that those kind of thoughts were meaningless, and he would just have to place his trust on the other captains. He would die as himself, not as a spineless coward full of regrets and doubts. How did he survive? Asked Yamamoto. Yhwach hummed for a second, and raised his brows in understanding. I suppose I could spare some mercy, and answer the last question of a dying man. He combined his own Raryoku with the reishi around him, and manipulated it into an ethereal shield. Now farewell, Yamamoto Genryusai. Worry not, you won't be the last to go. When Yamamoto saw the cruel smirk upon Yhwach's lips as he raised his finger, only one thought crossed his mind at that moment. It seems that we won't be separated for much longer, Chojiro. There was a flash of blue, and a 5-pointed cross was imprinted over Yamamoto's skin over his heart, marking the end of the 1,000-years-long life of the head captain of the Gotei 13. Various figures all over the Seraiti sensed the demise of the now-deceased head captain, and lost their composure. Yhwach's gaze flickered towards a disruption over the skies of the Soul Society, spotting a thin line that connected the boundaries of the dimensions, a garganta that had started to open. He let out a sigh, realizing that Quilge must have been defeated. Another loss of one of his children, but it wasn't an unforeseen event. There were no exceptions to the losses of war. Not even himself. If there was one thing Kyoraku Shunsui had not even once doubted for over 100 of years, it would be his teacher's strength. The old man was way out of him and Jashiro's league. No, out of everyone's league. He didn't doubt the old man's victory for even a second upon sensing the release of Zenka no Tachi. Every single member of the whole Gotei 13's spirits were lifted immensely, and he believed that it wouldn't take long for them to bring down the invaders to their knees. He thought so, until the enemy leader's Reiatsu was replaced with a more powerful and somewhat familiar one. The former substitute Shinigami, Kurosaki Ichigo. Apparently he was the son of Shiba Isshin and a Quincy, so the fact that their one-time ally had become the enemy didn't surprise him as much as it should have. A Quincy who had been caught in Captain Kuretsuchi's experiments, who had originally died because of another Shinigami's inaction. Could anyone really blame the boy for siding with the Quincy's if he actually learned the truth? Everything started to go wrong from that point. Shunsui couldn't believe it, but the young boy was facing his teacher on even grounds, despite the use of his Bankai. Why are you so surprised? I did tell you that our leader would win against yours, didn't I? I didn't think that you meant Kurosaki Ichigo when you said that. Shunsui deadpanned, wincing from the pain he felt from the right side of his face. He had lost half of his sight earlier on, and it was constantly bothering him to the point that it was actively hindering his combat prowess. Sternritter and Robert Accutrone, the Nier, actually let out a small chuckle, and replied nonchalantly. Technically His Majesty's successor could count as our leader. Therefore, I see nothing wrong in my statement. To say that he was shocked would be an understatement for Shunsui, so he decided against saying anything and concentrated on his fight. If he lost focus for even a moment, the well-aged Quincy would instantly pop up near him and fire his reishi gun point blank. He still didn't know how he did it, but it wasn't anything like Shunpo or an Arrancar's Sonido. Shunsui sincerely hoped that not all of the enemy Quincy were capable of this. It would be a taxing war ahead of them if they were. What made the fight more difficult was that his enemy had plenty of experience under his belt, and easily adapted to Kaden Kyokutsu's games. Usually Kaden Kyokutsu's mood was an important factor in his battles, and luckily for him, they actually wanted to win against the Sternritter. Shunsui would like to think that they were mad at the enemy for damaging his handsome face, but Kaden Kyokutsu would probably never admit it. Such a shame, really. All jokes aside, Shunsui was rather thankful that his Zanpakuto was in the mood for a winning game. He doubted that he would have been able to last this long without using his Bankai against the Quincy, if Kaden Kyokutsu weren't as cooperative as they were today. White, Robert called out smoothly, and started to fire Heilig files from his Reishi gun. Shunsui managed to parry the Reishi bullets, but he was caught off guard once more when Robert appeared right in front of him and fired a few more shots. Shunsui quickly used Shunpo to flash away the moment Robert appeared in front of him, but he didn't escape unharmed. He grunted in pain when a Heilig file hit his shoulder, which was exactly where his, White, captain's Haori was exposed. "Damn, he's good at our games," muttered Shunsui. The blood seeping from his shoulder colored his white Haori into deep bloody red, reducing the amount of the color white on his person. "We can talk this out instead of fighting, you know." "I'm afraid not," Robert cut off, eliciting a sigh from the 8th Division captain. Shunsui had to admit that Kaden Kyokutsu's game of irony wasn't in his favor today. The ridiculous amount of white on Robert's body would increase the damage his attacks could inflict on Shunsui drastically, if they did land on anything white. The man was covered with white from head to toe, for God's sake. And then, he lacked the color white on his own body in comparison to the Quincy, which would reduce any damage Robert could receive from his attacks. The blood seeping from his wound only served to further reduce the color. Shunsui was used to being in a disadvantage in the game itself, but he wasn't used to being the losing side in the actual fight. He really couldn't get a good grasp on how, but Robert kept on appearing near him without giving away any signs of doing so. It was just his own bad luck, that Robert had no intention of explaining his own powers. Shunsui very much preferred the Primera Espada Coyote Stark fellow as his opponent, even if the said Arrancar was admittedly stronger than his current one. He had found a kindred spirit in the Primera Espada, and it was such a shame that they had to meet as enemies. Shunsui had no doubt that they would have gotten along wonderfully, if they were given the chance to share some sake. "Ah, should I just use my Bankai? I'd rather not die today, since Nanao-chan would never let me hear the end of it if I did. If we were actually buried in a grave after our death like humans, she would visit it every day just for the purpose of spiting me." But still, he knew that it wouldn't be wise of him to bring out his Bankai into the open. His Bankai was far too dangerous to let the enemy get their hands on, so he would just have to make his best out of the current situation. Shunsui sighed, and removed his pink flowery kimono to increase the amount of white exposed on himself. He then used Shunpo towards Robert to approach him, and swung his twin Zanpakuto. He frowned when Robert drew up his silver suitcase and blocked Kaden with it, but his Zanpakuto was Kaden Kyokutsu, not Kaden. Kyokutsu found its way towards the Sternritter's arm, and left a shallow cut upon making contact. It didn't connect properly due to Robert's hasty retreat with Floodbildskrit, but Kaden Kyokutsu's game was absolute. "Interesting. Your Zanpakuto's ability can ignore our blood vene, an important piece of information I must report back to His Majesty if I somehow fail in my task to defeat you," stated Robert, as he observed his now limp right arm. What was supposed to be a shallow cut became deep enough to make it impossible for him to move his right arm on his own will. I suppose this was to be expected from one of the senior captains. "So, is there any chance of us solving this with a peaceful conversation now? I mean, with your arm in that state?" Shunsui trailed off, when strings of reishi attached themselves to Robert's limp arm. Apparently Shunsui knew this technique, ever since Captain Kuretsuchi had reported the discovery of this Quincy technique during his research. Whether it could be called research was irrelevant. He called it Ransotengai, and described it as the most powerful technique for the Quincy he was able to find from his research subjects. Shunsui muttered with a sigh, "I'll take that as a no." When Robert raised his gun and gathered reishi to continue his fire, Shunsui quickly submerged into the shadows. The rules of Kaden Kyokutsu's game had changed. Kajioni. Robert stared blankly at the place where Shunsui was a moment earlier, and observed the nearby shadows with an impassive gaze. If the captain wanted to play his games, he was more than happy to comply. It wasn't him who was in a hurry, after all. You can hide in the shadows all you want, but time is not on your side. We are only getting started in our invasion, Captain. Shunsui knew better than to rush at his opponent upon hearing those words, despite how much he wanted to do so. He would wait patiently until the enemy lost his focus for a single moment, even if it was less than a mere second. It didn't take long. The sky over somewhere near the 1st Division barracks was split into two by a black Sero, and Robert's attention was shifted towards the source of it for a minuscule moment. That was all the opening Shunsui needed, and he lunged from the shadow behind Robert. To his surprise, the Quincy's reaction time was more than enough for him to spin around and bring up his silver suitcase in the path of Kaden. What Robert probably didn't expect was for Kaden to completely penetrate his suitcase, and actually manage to connect with his stomach. Thankfully Robert's blood vein was active the whole time, since Shunsui was the one who had the liberty to attack on his own accord. Shunsui furrowed his brows when he noticed that Kaden hadn't been able to stab the Quincy deep enough, and quickly retreated with his shunpo. At least a dozen holes had formed on the ground Shunsui had been occupying several seconds earlier, showing Robert's displeasure at being wounded no matter the severity. I'm guessing whatever that blood vein you mentioned earlier is, it has something to do with how my attack couldn't harm you as much as it should have done. Asked Shunsui. Indeed, Shunsui was rather surprised at Robert's reply at this point, since he was actually expecting him to ignore his question. Still, why was it that only Arankars and Quincy's have some kind of defensive technique they can use to protect their body? It seemed so unfair, not that anything was ever fair in this world. Maybe they should try to create their own defensive technique. Anyway, your Zanpakuto's ability is quite intriguing, Robert said in an amused tone, interrupting Shunsui's speech. If the rules of your games didn't apply to both of us, I'd say that my chances of victory would be none to slim at best, but a game must be fair to both sides, yes. What a troublesome opponent I have here. Just like that number 1 Espada, he's using the games to his advantage. Shunsui thought to himself as Robert aimed his gun at his shadow and fired. He quickly leapt into the air, barely avoiding the reishi bullets that had been redirected towards him from his own shadow. Takaoni. The person higher up wins in this game, and the loser dies. Shunsui explained, only to be cut off from his explanations when a brilliant light spread all over the sky, along with a drastic increase in the temperature. He hastily retreated with a shunpo to a nearby rooftop, avoiding the Heilig files that were well on their way to skewer his body. Oh boy, looks like Yamaji's about to finish the kid. I wouldn't be so sure about that, Robert replied dryly, startling Shunsui with the lack of concern in his voice. While your belief in your leader is admirable, his life was forfeit the moment this war came into motion. Why do you think that his Bankai has yet to be stolen from him? Shunsui's eyes widened in realization, just as the two immeasurable forces collided. The enemy could have chose to steal the head captain's Bankai, but they didn't. Why, was it impossible for them to steal a Bankai on the head captain's caliber? Our successor chose to fight your leader without stealing his Bankai on his own accord for his amusement, and he was rather confident of his victory. Just then, the head captain's technique seemed to have overpowered the Quincy's, and Shunsui immediately regained his calm. He had been worried for his teacher, someone he considered as a grandfather figure. Of course, who was he to doubt the old man? He was the strongest person he had ever known, and always will be. And the whole world came crashing down onto him, as he sensed one of the Reiatsu diminishing, and it wasn't the one he had been expecting. It didn't take long for the near unbearable heat to cool down, and the burning presence of Yamamoto's flame-like Reiatsu was gone before he could even register what had occurred. Did the head captain actually lose? Surely not. How could he? And it finally hit him. Yamamoto Genryusai Shigekuni had lost to Kurosaki Ichigo. Yama-jii, screamed Shunsui, only to gasp in surprise and pain immediately after. His gaze wandered down, and stopped when he spotted a large gaping hole right above the sash of his shihakusho. Robert stared impassively at the captain as he fell backwards to the ground, and dropped his twin Zanpakutos. The man was too lax, but he was an admirable opponent. Therefore, Robert didn't hesitate when the opportunity was presented to him, even if the act itself was an underhanded move. He could place the blame on the captain for losing his focus, but he knew that the move wasn't by any means honorable. He raised his gun and targeted the fallen form of his foe, only to frown when a purple-haired woman wearing a captain's haori kicked the reishi gun out of his grasp. It seemed that the woman wasn't interested in fighting him, though. Yoruichi quickly draped Shunsui over her shoulder, and disappeared in an instant with her shunpo. Robert knew that the woman was Shihoin Yoruichi, and he had to admit that she lived up to her moniker, the goddess of flash. The only thing that stopped him from giving chase was the fact that she was to be considered as a potential ally for the time being. Yes, he could turn a blind eye for just this once. But if she dared to interfere again, her life would be forfeit. He would make sure of it. Her hand was resting on the hilt of her Zanpakuto before she herself had even realized it. The head captain had fallen in battle. Her lieutenant Katetsu Azane was oblivious to the event that had occurred, tending to the injuries of the young captain Hitsugaya. But herself on the other hand knew fully well that the Gote 13 was losing in the war, badly. Several of her fellow captains' Reiatsu began to diminish, or completely disappear all over the Seraiti. Unohana Retsu realized two things at that point. The Quincy's have returned stronger than ever, and the Gote 13 had become a mere shell of what it had been during the First War. Well, in terms of Gote, the current state was more fitting of the name compared to the founding members' Gote. But she knew that while the current Gote was failing spectacularly at the task of protecting the Seraiti, the original Gote would have at least forced the Quincy to a standstill. To think of it, it was rather ironic that the League of Bloodthirsty Monsters and Murderers would have been more successful at protecting the Seraiti. The first to go was Captain Kuretsuchi. Despite the foul nature of the man, Retsu knew that his knowledge and intelligence would have been a great asset to the Gote in a time of war. What was worse was the fact that the whole R&D department had been razed to the ground with 0 survivors. Then the Reiatsu of the younger captains followed, although they didn't die like the other captain. While Captain Kuchiki had yet to be brought into the 4th Division barracks, he was still alive, albeit barely. Captain Yukataki had brought an unconscious Captain Hitsugaya along with him. How he had managed to bring the young captain with him when he himself was barely grasping onto his consciousness, she would never know. The elder captain's illness had worsened considerably, and Retsu knew that it would be quite some time before he would be able to partake in the war in a better condition. She knew that restoring him to his full condition was out of her skills, despite her being the best Kaido practitioner in the Gote 13. She had no idea if Tenjiro would be capable of the feat, but she certainly couldn't. There was a surprising event that had occurred after that. Lieutenant Kuchiki had been brought into the medical facility, but what surprised her was the person who brought in the petite Shinigami. Apparently Lieutenant Kuchiki's Zanpakuto spirit was the one who brought her wielder in for her needed medical treatment. It was good to know that another Shinigami of the younger generation was well on her way of achieving Bankai. Yes, it was a welcome development for the Gote 13, especially during the time of war. When Sota no Shirayuki explained everything in her knowledge about the situation, Retsu wasn't as surprised as she should have been. Given the former substitute Shinigami's blood relations along with the 12th Division's misdeeds, it wasn't that much of a surprise that he had joined the Quincy's. Despite the fact that the young man was now an enemy of the Gote 13, the way he treated Lieutenant Kuchiki was rather admirable. If only he was a few hundred years older. Retsu thought to herself for a short moment, but quickly waved the thought away. Anyway, Retsu didn't find any serious injuries on Lieutenant Kuchiki's body, so she would probably wake up in due time. Captain Odoribashi with Captain Mugaruma came in after that, the 3rd Division captain carrying the latter over his shoulders. Captain Mugaruma was in a rather dire condition, with numerous bruises and broken bones all over his body. It was sheer dumb luck that his skull had been only cracked and not completely shattered, which would have caused him an instant death. Thankfully his injuries were treated early enough to be stabilized with ease. What actually saddened her was that despite how badly the Gote 13 was losing in the current invasion, the Sogo Kyugo Sumesho wasn't as busy as one would expect from the current situation. No, it wasn't any close to how she would have liked, and it wasn't that hard to figure out why. Most of the Shinigami were being killed before they could be brought in for their treatment, and she didn't like it. And then, the one person she didn't expect to die, the one person who wasn't supposed to die, had perished. Zaraki Kenpachi was no more. Her greatest sin was no longer the fact that she was the very reason Zaraki started to restrain his own strength for the sole purpose of enjoying a fight, in fear of permanently losing a worthy opponent for him to fight without holding back. No, her greatest sin was that the man who sought after a fight that could satisfy him, would no longer be able to fight to his heart's content. It was all because of what she had done to him that day, all those years ago. Had she been stronger so that he didn't need to hold back, or had she died at the least, all of this wouldn't have happened. It pained her to know that she would never get the chance to atone for her sins, to properly pass on the name of Kenpachi. But she knew that there was at least one thing that Zaraki would have wanted her to do, and she intended to do just that. Minazuki, I ask you to lend your strength to me once more. If I cannot fulfill my one purpose I needed to fulfill, then I shall make it my purpose to make my death a worthwhile one. I shall fight until my last breath, and bathe myself with the blood of the enemy. I bid you farewell, Kenpachi of Zaraki, the one and only true Kenpachi. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment and subscribe, as well as checking out the author on fanfiction.net.